He had conquered 47 kingdoms before he turned 30. He had made generals weep and rival alphas kneel in the mud. He had carved his name into the bones of this world with iron and blood and the kind of ruthless precision that lesser men called cruelty and greater men called survival. And on the night the moon goddess decided to humiliate him in front of every soul in the empire of Dreadmoor, Alpha King Valor Ashran stood before a blind woman in a silver gown and felt something crack open inside his chest that no battle had ever managed to reach. This is the story of what it costs to be powerful in all the wrong ways. This is the story of what happens when a man mistakes dominance for strength and fear for respect. And if you're watching from New York, Lagos, Manila, Jakarta, or wherever this night finds you, drop your city in the comments right now, hit that like, and don't you dare leave before the end, because what comes next will change the way you think about power, pride, and the price a man pays when he destroys the one thing that could have saved him. The sacred bonding ceremony had not been held in Dreadmoor for 11 years. The last time the ritual fires had burned on the Imperial Terrace, the Alpha King's father had stood upon the obsidian platform and received his mate, a fierce-eyed woman from the northern wolf clans who went on to bear him 3 sons and outlast every general who ever doubted her. The Empire remembered her. They built her statue in white marble in the eastern courtyard, facing the mountain she had come from, and every year on the anniversary of her death, soldiers left iron flowers at her feet because she had ridden into the Battle of Redmere at 43 years old with a sword in each hand and refused to die until the last enemy banner hit the ground. Valor had grown up watching his mother and learning, or so he believed, what strength looked like. He understood now, standing in the robing chamber while his attendants dressed him in the ceremonial black and gold armor, that he had learned only half the lesson. He had watched his mother's ferocity and memorized it. He had never stopped to notice how his father looked at her when she wasn't performing for anyone. The soft devastation in the old king's eyes. The way the most feared alpha in the northern territories became something quieter, something almost unguarded. In the one room where he did not have to be a king, Valor had been 20 when his father died. He had not had time to ask those questions. He had been too busy surviving the aftermath. "Stop fidgeting," said Commander Drael, adjusting the pauldron on Valor's left shoulder with the casual authority of a man who had served the Asheran throne for 30 years and had long since stopped being impressed by it. He was short and gray-bearded and had a scar that ran from his left ear to the corner of his jaw that he'd gotten in a bar fight at 19 and never explained to anyone. He was also the only person alive who could tell Valor to stop fidgeting without losing teeth for it. "You're pulling left. You always pull left when you're thinking too hard." "I'm not thinking." "You're always thinking. It's your worst habit. Hold still." Valor held still. Through the tall lancet windows of the robbing chamber, the capital spread out below him in a wash of torch fire and evening smoke. The streets crammed with citizens who had come from every province to witness the ceremony. 40,000 people pressed into the imperial quarter. Maybe more. They had been singing since midday. The sound drifted up even now, low and rhythmic. The old bonding hymns that Valor had heard only in historical archives, because in his reign there had been nothing to sing them for, until tonight. "Drael, my king, what do you know about House Voss?" The commander's hands paused for a fraction of a second. Just a fraction. Most men would have missed it. Valor did not miss things. "Minor nobility," Drael said carefully. "Eastern territories. The old lord died 4 years ago. His eldest son holds the title now. Edric Voss. Sits on the Eastern Council, keeps his head down. Competent administrator. Unambitious." "And the daughter?" Another pause, longer this time. "Lady Elira, second-born. There was an illness when she was a child. Fever, they said. She lost her sight." Valor said nothing. He kept his face still and let Drael finish with the armor and step back. In the polished black surface of the great standing mirror across the chamber, Valor looked at himself. Tall, broad. The armor fit him the way it had been designed to fit him, like a second skin, like a declaration. His hair was dark and kept short because long hair was a liability in close combat, and he had never stopped being, at his core, a man who prepared for close combat. His eyes were the color of storm clouds over the Ashfen ranges, gray with something greenish underneath, and they held the particular quality of stillness that predators develop when they have learned that stillness itself is a form of power. He looked like a king. He looked exactly like what he was. He looked, he thought, at nothing in particular, like a man who had never once in his life been surprised by the thing that came for him next. He would remember that thought later and understand what a lie it was. The ceremony grounds occupied the full expanse of the Imperial Terrace, a vast stone platform built into the cliff face above the capital that had served the Asherin kings for 6 generations as their most sacred public space. On coronation days and treaty signings, and the rare astronomical occasions that the old scholars declared significant, the terrace became the axis around which the empire oriented itself. Tonight it was lit by 1,000 hanging lanterns in amber and white, and the court, every lord and lady and military commander and council member who mattered in Dreadmoor, stood in ordered rows along the edges of the platform, their faces carefully arranged into whatever expression they calculated appropriate for the occasion. Vialor had made his entrance an hour ago. He stood now at the center of the terrace on the obsidian dais, elevated 3 steps above the crowd, flanked by his honor guard. The ritual officials moved around him in their designated patterns, lighting the ceremonial fires in the iron bowls at each corner of the platform, murmuring the ancient bonding words in the old tongue. The air smelled of wood smoke and pine resin, and underneath both the cold mineral sharpness of the mountain night. He watched the eastern gate. He had been told the hour. He had been told the protocol. The mate would enter through the eastern gate, escorted by the court warden, and cross the full length of the terrace to the dais. It was a deliberate design, a long walk, witnessed by everyone, meant to display the mate's dignity and presence and the Empire's approval of the bond. He heard her before he saw her, not her voice, not footsteps. He heard the change in the crowd. It was subtle. The low murmur of 400 people shifted register. Not louder, but different in quality. The way sound changes when the people making it become uncertain about what they're reacting to. A ripple moved through the assembled nobility like wind through standing grain, starting at the eastern gate and rolling forward, and Valor watched it come toward him with the detached focus of a general, reading a battlefield, and already knowing the outcome isn't going to be what anyone planned for. Then the crowd parted enough for him to see. Lady Elira Voss was not what he had been expecting. He had, he realized, built an image in his mind from the fragments Drael had given him. Minor nobility, eastern territories, lost her sight. He had assembled these pieces into a picture that was, he understood now with sudden clarity, completely his own invention. The woman who crossed the Imperial Terrace was not the picture he had invented. She was smaller than he'd thought, not frail, that wasn't the right word, but compactly built, with the kind of careful uprightness in her posture that comes not from training, but from years of navigating a world built for people who could see it. Her silver gown was simple, almost severe, nothing like the elaborate confections the other noblewomen wore. Her dark hair was pinned back from her face with only a plain comb. She wore no jewels except a single thin silver chain at her throat. She moved slowly. Her hand rested on the arm of the court warden, a tall, hollow-cheeked official named Sorrent, who looked deeply uncomfortable with his assignment, and she moved at the pace he set, slightly cautious, her steps measured. Her face was angled slightly downward, the way a person's face angles when they are tracking the world through senses other than sight. Her eyes were open, pale gray, nearly silver. Beautiful, objectively, in the way that certain things are beautiful that have been shaped by something difficult, the quality of a scar that is healed well, or the surface of a river that runs over stone. They moved, the eyes, but not toward anything. They drifted slowly, catching light without tracking it, seeing nothing. The crowd watched her cross the terrace in almost complete silence. Valor watched her cross the terrace and felt his chest do the thing again, that cracking sensation. Faint but undeniable, deep behind his sternum, in the place where his wolf lived. His wolf, who had been dormant for weeks in the way wolves go dormant before something significant shifts, was suddenly fully awake. She reached the base of the dais. She stopped. And Valor Asherin, Alpha King of Dreadmoor, understood in a single breathless instant what the moon goddess had decided for him. This woman was his mate. The knowledge wasn't metaphorical. It wasn't a feeling he could argue with or a conclusion he could reason away. It was physical fact slamming into him like a fist, the mate bond recognition hitting him in the chest and the gut simultaneously. His wolf surged toward her with a desperation that was almost embarrassing in its intensity, an animal response that bypassed every layer of control and calculation and kingship he had spent 20 years building. She did not react to him. She stood at the base of the dais with her hand on Soren's arm and her pale eyes moving in their slow, unfocused way. And she had no way to know what was happening inside him, no way to read his face at this distance without sight. And so she simply stood and waited with a patience that somehow, irrationally, made the cracking sensation in his chest worse. The ritual official stepped forward and began the bonding declaration. Vialor stopped hearing the words after the first three. What he heard instead was the silence of 400 people watching him. 400 people who ran his empire, who commanded his armies, who administered his taxes and enforced his laws and feared him. His fear was the mechanism by which Dreadmoor functioned. He had understood this since he was 20 years old and built the entire system on it deliberately. 400 people who were now watching their king be handed a blind woman as his fated mate and waiting, every one of them, to take their cue from his face. He knew what his face was doing. He could feel it. The stillness that he had cultivated for 20 years, the complete absence of readable emotion, the quality that his enemies described as being like negotiating with stone. His face was doing that. His face was unreadable, but his wolf was screaming. The ritual official reached the declaration point. Alpha King Valor Ashran, do you receive this mate offered by the ancient bond and claim her place beside you as consort of Dreadmoor? The silence on the terrace became the kind of silence that has weight. Valor looked at Elira Voss. She had tilted her head slightly toward the sound of the official's voice, and in doing so had inadvertently turned her face more toward Vialor, and he could see her jaw. The line of it. The slight tension there. She was afraid, he realized. Not panicking. She was holding herself together with an effort that the court couldn't see because they were watching her eyes and seeing nothing. But afraid. Her knuckles on Soren's arm had gone white. She was afraid, and she was holding herself together anyway. He thought, this woman has been holding herself together for a very long time. He thought, I am about to make it worse. He thought these things and could not stop himself from thinking them. And then he opened his mouth and let 20 years of calculated empire management speak for him. No, Valor said. Da. The word landed in the silence like a stone into standing water. Ripples went outward in every direction. He heard someone in the assembled court draw a sharp breath. He heard someone else, a woman from the eastern section, let out a sound that was not quite a gasp and not quite a laugh. He kept his eyes on Elira because he could not make himself look away, and he needed, with a ferocity that baffled him, to see her face when it happened. He saw it. The stillness that came over her was the stillness of a person who has been bracing for a blow and finally receives it and cannot allow themselves the relief of crumbling. Her jaw tightened. Her grip on Soren's arm tightened. For one moment, just one, something moved behind those pale eyes. Not sight, but feeling, sharp and wild, and instantly, ruthlessly suppressed. She pressed her lips together. That was all. She did not cry. She did not argue. She did not make a sound. The ritual official, whose face had gone the color of old ash, looked at Valor with the expression of a man watching a fire he is responsible for and has absolutely no way to stop. My king, the bond is noted, Valor said, and declined. The ancient pact does not provide for, I'm rewriting it. He kept his voice level, flat. The voice he used when decisions were made and further conversation was wasteful. Record the rejection in the Imperial Archive. The bond is dissolved by royal authority. Lady Voss is to be given accommodations appropriate to her rank. He paused, and the pause was a choice, and he made it badly. At the Eastern Tower, the ceremony is concluded. He turned away from her and stepped off the dais. Behind him, he heard Soren say something to her in a low, careful voice. He heard her say nothing in response. He did not look back. He told himself this was because kings do not look back. He had believed this for 20 years. He believed it now with slightly less certainty than he ever had before in his life, which should have told him something and did not. The aftermath of the ceremony moved through the imperial court with the particular efficiency of collective agreement not to name what had just happened. Lords who had flinched found reasons to have been looking elsewhere. Ladies who had drawn breath found topics of conversation unrelated to blind women in silver gowns. The imperial court of Dreadmoor, which had survived 6 generations of Ashran kings through the refined practice of institutional amnesia, absorbed the events of the sacred bonding ceremony within 40 minutes, and produced, in its place, a version of events that was cleaner and less troubling. The mate had been unsuitable. The king had exercised appropriate judgment. The empire remained secure. Valor heard all of this from behind the closed doors of his war room, where he had gone immediately after the ceremony, and where he now sat at the head of the long iron table with Commander Drael on his left and High Marshal Kath on his right, receiving reports he was not reading because he could not concentrate on them. The Selwyn border situation requires a decision by the end of the week, Kath was saying. Kath was a thick-shouldered man with a permanently sunburned neck and the manner of someone who had solved most of his problems by hitting them hard enough. He was excellent at his job and had the emotional perception of a warhammer. If we don't send the 4th Regiment, Selwyn reads it as hesitation. They've been testing the boundary posts for 3 months. Send them, Valor said. My king, the full regiment, or send them all. Let Selwyn read whatever they want. Drael was watching him from the left with the particular quality of attention that meant the old commander was cataloging and filing information for later use. Valor recognized the look and ignored it. There's also the matter of the Voss situation, said Halleck, the imperial secretary, from the far end of the table. Halleck was thin and precise and had a voice that carried no opinion about anything, which was a professional achievement Valor had always respected. Lady Elira's household. She arrived with 3 attendants. Given the revised arrangements, we'll need to confirm what she's permitted. She keeps her attendants, Valor said. A brief silence. He felt Drael mark it. The eastern tower is furnished but not maintained, Halleck continued. It'll need provisions, staff. Her brother, Lord Edric Voss, has already sent a message requesting to handle it. Valor stood. The others stood. Drael, stay. The room cleared. When the door closed, Drael sat back down without being invited. That, too, was a privilege Valor had never formally granted him and had never revoked. He poured himself a glass of the dark northern wine from the carafe on the table, looked at it, and did not drink it. Say it, Valor said. Say what, my king? Whatever you're sitting there not saying. Drael turned the glass in his hands. His scar caught the candlelight. In 30 years of serving this throne, the old commander said slowly, I have watched you make decisions that other men would not have had the stomach for. I have watched you make hard choices and brutal choices and choices that cost people things they didn't get back. He paused. Tonight was different. Different how? It wasn't hard for you. That's the difference. Drael put the glass down. It should have been hard, even if the conclusion was the same, even if you'd still done it. A man with any working conscience should have had to fight himself to get there. You walked off that dais like you'd just declined a trade agreement. Valor said nothing. The woman, Drael continued with the careful precision of a man placing his feet on uncertain ground, stood there and took it, in front of 400 people. She didn't make a sound. I noticed. Did you? I said I noticed. I know what you said. Drael stood. He was shorter than Valor by nearly a foot, and it made no difference. I'm going to tell you something, and you're going to hear it, because I've earned the right, and you know it. Whatever you saw up on that terrace and told yourself was a liability. It wasn't. What you saw was a person who has spent her whole life being underestimated by men like you, and you just made sure she has good reason to count you among them. He moved to the door. The reports from Selwyn will be ready by morning. He left. Valor stood in the empty war room and looked at the wall. After a long time, he picked up the glass of wine Drael had poured and left untouched, and drank all of it, and poured another, and did not drink that one. Through the thick walls of the imperial palace, far away and muffled by distance and stone, he could still hear the citizens singing in the streets of the capital. The bonding hymns, they had not gotten the news yet. Or they had, and they were singing anyway, because the songs were older than the Ashran kings and would outlast them. His wolf paced in the dark behind his ribs and did not stop. The Eastern Tower was not, technically, a place of exile. This was the distinction that Halleck, the imperial secretary, made careful note of in the official records. Lady Elira Voss had been assigned accommodations in the Eastern Tower, a structure that was, in the historical archive, designated as part of the imperial residential complex. That it had not been used in 60 years. That its 2 upper floors had sustained storm damage 3 decades ago and been only partially repaired. That it stood at the very edge of the capital's defensive wall, separated from the palace proper by a full quarter-mile of courtyard and storage buildings, and the particular administrative dead zone that accumulates around structures no one uses. That it was, in any honest reading, about as far from the center of power as you could get, while technically remaining inside the imperial compound. None of these details appeared in the official record. Elira did not need the official record. She could read a room through its sounds and its silences, and the particular way that Sorrent had stopped talking after his first 2 sentences of the prepared statement about her accommodations. She had enough experience with well-intentioned men delivering bad news in careful language to hear what he was not saying. "How far from the palace?" she said. "My lady," distant Sorrent. A pause. "A quarter mile, approximately." "And the stairs in the tower?" Another pause. "There are some repairs that haven't been—" "How many stairs are uneven?" A longer pause. "I'll send someone to map them for you. Before morning, I promise." She had believed him because Sorrent was not a cruel man and had spent the remaining hours of the evening in the tower's lower sitting room, which smelled of dust and old wood and something faintly chemical that she eventually identified as old lamp oil from barrels that had never been moved. Her 3 attendants, Marta, who was 60 and had been her mother's attendant before she was Elira's, young Till, who was 17 and had been assigned to Elira's household 2 years ago and had the nervous energy of someone permanently braced for disaster, and the silent, steady Wren, who had worked in the Voss household for 15 years and communicated primarily through the quality of his footsteps, moved through the rooms around her, doing what they could with what was there. Marta made a fire. Till found lamps and lit them, and did not say that there was no point lighting lamps for a woman who could not see them, which was kind because there had been guests before who did say that. Wren moved crates and furniture and said nothing, as was his custom. Elira sat in a chair near the fire and listened to the distant sound of the capital celebrating and thought about the moment on the terrace with the thoroughness and precision she applied to things she needed to understand completely. She had known, or had suspected, or had constructed the possibility from available evidence that this might not go well. Her brother Edric had been too careful in his language when he sent her the formal summons. The court warden Sorrent had been too quiet during the carriage journey. Even the servants in the preparation chamber had moved around her with the focused efficiency of people working to a standard they were afraid of not meeting, the quality of service that appears when someone important is unhappy and has made it known. She had known all of this and still went, because the bond was real. She had felt it building for weeks before the ceremony. This strange magnetic pull in her chest that she had no prior experience of and no framework for except the old stories she had read in the archives back home, tracing her fingers across the embossed pages, back when she still found the old stories charming rather than instructive. She had felt the pull and followed it here. And then she had stood at the base of that dais and felt it intensify to something almost physical, a warmth, a recognition, a sense of arriving somewhere. And then she had heard his voice. No. One word, flat, certain, applied to her like a stamp. She brought her hand up now in the dim firelight of the Eastern Tower's sitting room and pressed her palm against her sternum, where the bond should have been anchoring, where it should have taken root and begun the slow, deep process of interweaving. Instead, it sat there like something half-made, unfinished, pulled in one direction by the biological imperative of what she was, and held away from completion by a king who had looked at her and made a calculation. She was not angry yet. She understood this was coming. The anger, when it arrived, would be substantial, but it had not arrived yet. What she felt now was simpler and older, and in some ways worse. She felt like herself at 9 years old, waking up in the fever dark with her sight gone, and her mother crying in the doorway, and her father saying her name in a voice she had never heard from him before. That quality of being a problem that adults were struggling to manage. "My lady." Marta crouched near her chair, the way she always had, her old knees cracking with the effort. Her hand found Elira's and held it. She did not say anything. She had learned over 33 years of Elira's life when words were what was needed and when they were not. This was not a when words were needed moment. Elira held Marta's hand in both of hers and stared at the orange glow of the fire and listened to the city celebrate a bonding that had not happened and felt the bond that wasn't sitting in her chest like an open wound. "I'm fine," she said eventually. Marta made a sound that conveyed, with remarkable efficiency, a complete assessment of that statement and its accuracy. "I'll be fine," Elira amended. "Give me the night, Len." The first week passed with the logic of things that have been set in motion and have no mechanism for stopping. Valor ran his empire. He met with his council and signed his orders and reviewed his military reports and had 3 consecutive conversations about the Selwyn border situation and one about grain tariffs in the southern provinces, and one that lasted 4 hours about the succession laws. And at no point during any of these conversations did he think about the Eastern Tower or the woman in it. This was not true. He thought about both continuously, but he had extensive practice at maintaining the appearance of thinking about neither, and so the appearance was maintained. On the 5th day, he asked Halleck about the tower provisioning as though it were a minor administrative matter. Halleck, who missed very little, confirmed that provisions had been arranged and that Lady Elira's household had settled in adequately. He used the word adequately with the precision of a man who knew the difference between adequate and comfortable and was choosing not to flag the distinction unless asked directly. Valor did not ask directly. On the 7th day, his wolf started making it difficult to sleep. This was the part no one discussed, the part that the histories and the formal records and the court narratives all managed to elide in favor of the cleaner version where kings made decisions and wolves followed their kings. In practice, in the hours between 2 and 4 in the morning, Violor lay in the dark of the royal bedchamber and felt his wolf pace, back and forth, back and forth, the restless circling of an animal who knows something is wrong with a precision that transcends language. The mate bond, even rejected, even incomplete, did not vanish. It sat in his chest exactly where it had landed on the terrace, warm and insistent and deeply inconvenient, and his wolf tracked it the way wolves track any unresolved thread, with single-minded intensity and no particular interest in the political calculus of the man it shared a body with. He got up at 3 in the morning on the 8th night and stood at his window and looked east. He could not see the tower from the palace, too many buildings between them, but he knew the direction. "This is not useful," he told his wolf. His wolf did not respond to this because his wolf was not interested in useful. His wolf was interested in the woman in the East Tower who had held herself together in front of 400 people and had not made a sound. The first sign that something was changing came on the 14th night, in the form of a sound that should not have been possible. Elira was in the upper sitting room of the tower. The stairs had been mapped, as Sorrent promised, and she had memorized the layout of all 3 usable floors within the first 4 days, when she heard it. Not heard. That was the wrong word. She perceived it. The way she perceived things that had no sound, the shape of a room from its echo, the direction of wind from its pressure on her skin, the emotional state of a person from the quality of their breathing. This was like that, but different, deeper, coming from somewhere that wasn't outside at all. It was like a voice that used no language. It came from beneath her skin. She went very still in her chair, the way she went still when something in her environment shifted and she needed all her attention to map it accurately. Her hands gripped the armrests. Her breath slowed. The sensation spread from her sternum outward along her arms, tracing pathways under her skin that she had no anatomical explanation for, warm and tingling and deeply wrong in the specific way that things are wrong when they are also, simultaneously and inexplicably, right. She pressed her fingers to the inside of her left wrist. Under the skin, faint but unmistakable, something was moving. She could not see it, but she could feel it, fine lines of warmth tracing patterns she could almost read, almost recognize, like words in a language she had known before she had a language. Her fingers traced the shapes reflexively, following them up her forearm, across the inside of her elbow, up toward her shoulder. "Marta," she said quietly. Marta appeared in the doorway from the adjoining room. A pause. Then, in a voice that was completely level and gave away absolutely nothing, Marta said, "My lady, Your arm. What does it look like? Another pause, longer. There are marks under the skin. They're glowing, faintly. Illyra said nothing. Silver, Marta said. The color is silver, like, I don't know what like. I've never seen anything like. The warmth continued spreading. It reached her shoulder and moved across her collarbone, and she felt it climb her neck and the base of her skull, and she thought, with a calm that surprised her, I have been carrying this my whole life. I have been carrying this my whole life, and I had no idea. She thought, the blindness. She thought, the fever. She thought, what if those were not the same event? The marks faded after perhaps 3 minutes, leaving her skin looking normal, leaving her feeling warmer than she had been, leaving her with the specific quality of certainty that comes when a piece of something large and old and previously invisible has just made itself known. She sat in the dark of the eastern tower for a long time after Marta had gone back to bed, with her hand on her own wrist, tracing shapes she couldn't see that had burned themselves briefly into her skin, like a message from something deep inside her that had finally, after 26 years, decided the time for patience was over. Across the quarter-mile of imperial courtyard and stone, in the palace proper, the Alpha King was standing at his window looking east and feeling his wolf go completely still for the first time in 2 weeks. His wolf, who had been pacing without stopping, suddenly stopped, sat, lifted its head, and made a sound inside Valor's chest that he had no name for. Not a howl, not a warning, something older than either, something that sounded, if pressed, like recognition. The letter from Lord Edric Voss arrived at the Imperial Palace on the 17th morning. Valor read it in his council chamber with Drael standing by the window, and the morning light coming gray and flat through the glass. The letter was precise and controlled in the manner of a man who had spent considerable effort keeping his rage in the appropriate register. Edric Voss did not make accusations. He made observations. He observed that his sister's assigned accommodations were unsuitable. He observed that the Eastern Tower's structural condition posed certain risks that would be difficult to defend publicly. He observed that Lady Illyra had received no formal communication from the palace since the ceremony, and that this absence of communication was itself a form of communication. He was, the letter made clear between every careful line, furious. He was also, the letter made equally clear, smart enough to know that fury aimed directly at an Alpha King from a minor noble house was not a survivable strategy. Valor folded the letter and set it on the table. "Move her," he said. Drael looked at him. "My king?" "Find her rooms in the residential east wing, with the other court ladies. It's—" He stopped. "The tower is inadequate. Move her." A silence. Drael's face went through a series of expressions that, on a less controlled man, would have been readable as surprise. On Drael, they were simply very slight adjustments in the set of his eyebrows. And the official designation? She is still Lady Voss. She has a rank, accommodated appropriately. The court will ask questions. The court always asks questions. The court is welcome to ask them somewhere I'm not. He picked up the next report in the stack before him. "Handle it, Drael." "Of course, my king." Drael moved toward the door. "And Drael." "My king." Valor did not look up from the report. "Make sure she has a room with a south-facing window. The south-facing rooms get more sun." He paused. "For the warmth. The tower has poor heat." He kept his eyes on the report in front of him. He was not, he told himself, doing what it looked like he was doing. He was making an administrative correction. He was addressing a logistical inadequacy. He was not standing in his war room at 3 a.m. looking east. He was not thinking about the line of her jaw. He was not aware of the direction of the bond that wasn't at every hour of every day with the precision of a compass that had found north and refused to be argued out of it. He was the Alpha King of Dreadmoor. He had made his decision. He heard Drael leave and heard, in the silence after the door closed, the quality of a man who knows something about himself that he is not yet ready to say aloud. She refused the transfer. Halleck brought the news personally, which told Valor how seriously the man took it. The imperial secretary stood in the doorway of the council chamber at midday with his ledger under his arm and the expression of someone reporting a weather event that falls outside normal parameters. Lady Voss thanks the palace for the reassignment, Halleck said carefully. However, she has declined. Valor looked up from the map he had been studying. Declined. Yes, my king. Explain declined. Halleck referred to no notes, which meant he had memorized the response, which meant the response had required memorizing. Lady Voss conveyed, through her attendant Marta, that she is settled in the Eastern Tower and does not wish to be moved. She further conveyed that she would appreciate it if any future communications regarding her accommodations were addressed to her directly, as she is fully capable of receiving and processing information without an intermediary. A pause. Those were her exact words? Near enough, my king. Valor looked at the map, looked at it for a while without actually seeing it. Then he said, She's right. My king? Future communications. Address them to her directly. He picked up his stylus. She's right. We should have been doing that from the beginning. Halleck made a note. His face maintained its perfect professional blankness, but his stylus moved with a slightly more decisive quality than usual, which was, from Halleck, the equivalent of a standing ovation. Get. Valor went himself on the 22nd day. He told no one. He told himself he was taking a morning walk through the eastern sections of the compound, which was an activity that no one who knew him would have found plausible if they'd been asked, but no one was asked because no one knew. He went alone, in plain clothes, which was its own kind of statement about how badly he was lying to himself, because a man in plain clothes walking through his own imperial compound at 6 a.m, with 2 personal guards trailing at distance, was not being inconspicuous. He was just being inconspicuous about his motivations. He reached the eastern tower as the sun was coming up over the capital walls. He stood outside it for a moment. It was, he observed with a flat candor, a genuinely miserable building. Gray stone. One of the upper windows had been boarded over from the storm damage. The iron brackets on the outer wall had rusted to the color of dried blood. The small courtyard in front of it had weeds growing through the paving stones. He stood there and felt the mate bond register her proximity with the simple animal insistence of a body that has been denied something it needed. Then he heard her voice. She was around the south side of the tower, in a sliver of early morning sunlight that reached that wall before it reached the courtyard. He moved to where he could hear without being heard, a thing he was good at, a thing that required no particular pride, and listened. She was talking to someone. Her attendant. The older woman, Marta, he thought. She was talking about the layout of the tower grounds, describing it from her own perception, measuring it in footsteps and wind direction, and the sound of the Capitol wall's morning guard change, which was, she was explaining to Marta, audible from the south courtyard in a way that gave her a reliable bearing point. She was mapping the world the way she mapped everything. 14 steps to the wall, she said. Left turn. 22 to the corner. Right turn. From the corner, the sun hits directly at sunrise. I can feel it on my face there. So that's due east. And what do you want to know east for? Marta asked. The old woman's voice was warm and dry and had the tone of someone who has lived long enough to ask questions without expecting the answer to make sense. A pause. I'm learning the territory, Illyra said. Whatever happens next, I want to know where I am. She said it without self-pity and without drama, with the straightforward practicality of a woman who had decided that the luxury of despair was available to people with more resources than she currently had. She said it the way a soldier says it before a battle. Not bravado, not acceptance, something harder and more specific than either. Orientation, preparation. Valor stood around the corner of the eastern tower in the cold morning air and felt the cracking sensation in his chest go from a hairline fracture to something that required more urgent structural attention. He left without announcing himself. He walked back through the eastern compound toward the palace and thought about what it meant that a woman he had publicly rejected and exiled to a crumbling tower was spending her mornings mapping the territory rather than writing plaintive letters to the palace or weeping in the dark or doing any of the things that would have been, by any reasonable human measure, justified. He thought about what it said about what she'd already survived before she ever arrived in Dreadmoor. He thought about what it said about himself that he had looked at her on that terrace and seen liability. His wolf, walking the same pace as him through the same morning, had no interest in his thinking. His wolf had felt her, had felt the proximity of her, 22 feet around a corner of gray stone, and had gone so still in Valor's chest that his whole body had felt like held breath. His wolf wanted him to go back. He did not go back. Not that morning. The Festival of Crowns was 40 days away when the sky above the eastern tower cracked for the first time. It happened on a night of hard weather, the kind of winter storm that came down from the Ashfin Ranges with genuine malice and hammered the capital for hours. Valor was in the war room reviewing the Selwyn reports when one of his night guards came in with an expression that had been carefully assembled into something that didn't communicate panic, which meant the man was panicking. "My king, there's something you should see." He went to the war room's eastern window. Above the tower, visible even through the driving rain, even through the layers of storm cloud, there was a light. Not lamplight, not fire. Something that had no comparison in any weather phenomenon Valor had knowledge of. A vertical column of silver-white illumination rising from the tower roof into the storm clouds, and where it touched the clouds moved away from it. Not blown, moved, as though the light itself was claiming space. It lasted perhaps 30 seconds. Then it was gone. The storm continued. The tower sat dark and silent in the rain, like it had always sat dark and silent, like nothing had come from it, like the light had been a trick of exhausted eyes and bad weather and the particular quality of pressure headaches that come with nights like this. Valor stood at the window for a long time after the light had gone. Behind him, the night guard was breathing very carefully in the way of someone who has decided not to have opinions about what they just witnessed. Valor turned from his window. "Who else saw that?" "The Eastern Wall Watch, my king. 3 men. Bring them to me in the morning. Tonight, they saw nothing." "My king." He turned back to the window. The eastern tower sat dark in the rain. The mate bond in his chest, the incomplete, rejected, inconvenient mate bond, was doing something he had no word for. Not pulling, not aching, something more like vibrating, a frequency he felt in his back teeth. He thought about a woman mapping territory by footsteps and sunlight. He thought about marks under skin that moved like writing. He thought about what his court would say when the light appeared again, because he knew, with the same bone-deep certainty he brought to reading battlefields, that it would appear again, and who would notice, and what questions they would start asking. He thought about the Festival of Crowns, 40 days away, with every noble in the empire in attendance. He was still standing at the window at midnight when Betrayal came to find him. The old commander stood in the doorway, looked at the dark tower in the rain, and said nothing for a long moment. "Betrayal," Valor said without turning. "My king." What does a man do when he realizes he made the wrong call? The silence that followed had the careful quality of a man measuring his words against the weight of 30 years of service and the weight of something larger than both. "A wise man," Betrayal said finally, "corrects it, before the cost gets too high. And if the correction requires something that looks like weakness." "To who?" Valor said nothing. "To who, my king?" Betrayal repeated. "Your court? Your generals? Your empire?" He moved to stand beside Valor at the window, looking out at the same dark tower in the same driving rain. "Or to yourself?" The storm hammered the windows. The eastern tower sat silent and dark in the distance. And in the tower, though neither man could know this, Elira Voss was sitting in her chair by the fire with both hands pressed against her sternum and her blind eyes wide open, staring at nothing, feeling something enormous and old and not at all dormant move through her body like a tide. And beneath both her palms, beneath the skin of her chest, the silver light was burning. Mokken. On the morning of the 38th day before the Festival of Crowns, a messenger arrived at the eastern tower with a letter bearing the imperial seal. The letter was addressed for the first time directly to Lady Elira Voss, not to her household, not to her attendant, not to a court intermediary. She held it in both hands while Marta read it aloud. It contained 3 sentences. 2 were formal administrative language. The third was not. The third sentence said, "I would like to speak with you." Signed, Valor Ashwin. Elira sat in silence for a long time after Marta finished reading. Then she pressed her fingers to the inside of her wrist, where the silver lines had burned brightest. She felt them there, warm and waiting, Not fading anymore. Not retreating. Growing. "Marta," she said quietly. "My lady." "Don't send a reply yet." Marta made the sound that meant she understood. Elira tilted her head toward the south wall, where the morning sun would be strongest, where she had learned to orient herself by warmth and bearing. "Due east," she thought. "Whatever comes next, I know where I am." Outside, in the direction she could not see, but could feel with the precision of something no longer entirely human, the imperial palace of Dreadmoor stood in the winter morning, and in it, a king sat at a window with an unanswered letter on the table before him and the beginning of understanding in his chest. And above the city, in skies still heavy with the remnants of last night's storm, a single star burned in broad daylight, visible, impossible, waiting. The reply did not come. 3 days passed, then 4, then 7. Veilor checked nothing. He asked no one. He did not send a follow-up letter or dispatch a messenger to inquire or do any of the things that the part of him that had written the letter in the first place was insisting he do. He was the Alpha King of Dreadmoor. He had sent the letter because it was the correct administrative response to an ongoing situation that required resolution. If the resolution was silence, then silence was the answer, and he would treat it as such, and he would continue running his empire, and the matter was closed. He was at the window again on the 8th night when Drael found him. "You're going to wear a groove in that floor," Drael said, setting a stack of reports on the war room table that no one had asked him to bring, and that were, they both understood, not the reason he was there. "I'm reading." "You're facing the wrong direction for reading." Veilor said nothing. Through the dark glass, the eastern tower sat exactly where it had always sat, at exactly the distance it had always been. The compound lights threw it into low relief. Gray stone, rusted brackets, the one-boarded window. From this distance, it looked exactly like what it was, a building that had been forgotten by the people who should have maintained it. He had done that. He had made that decision and every smaller decision that followed from it. He had looked at a woman who arrived in a simple silver gown with her hand on a court warden's arm, and his wolf had known, and he had overridden his wolf with 20 years of political calculus. And now here he was, 8 nights later, staring at the building he'd sent her to and waiting for a reply to a 3-sentence letter like a man waiting for a verdict. This was the thing about power that none of the histories prepared you for. They described its acquisition, its exercise, the mechanics of force and fear and loyalty. What they did not describe was the specific quality of its failure. The moment when you understand that the systems you built to protect yourself have sealed you inside something you cannot get out of without dismantling parts of the structure. And the structure is the only thing keeping you upright. Veilor had built an empire on the principle that strength was indivisible, that any admission of error was an invitation to challenge, that the alpha who showed uncertainty was the alpha who died, or worse, the alpha who lived and watched everything he built get taken apart by the men who had been waiting for exactly that admission. He had learned this at 20 years old, in the blood-soaked weeks after his father's death, when 3 rival clans had moved simultaneously on Dreadmoor's borders, and he had responded with a ferocity that was, in honest retrospect, partially grief and partially terror dressed up as dominance. It had worked. That was the problem. It had worked so comprehensively, for so long, that he had stopped being able to separate the tactic from the truth. "She's not going to reply," Veilor said. "No," Drael agreed. "She's not. Can't blame her." "No." Veilor turned from the window. Drael was sitting at the table, not looking at the reports he'd brought, looking instead at the floor with the expression of a man engaged in a private argument he's been losing for some time. "What would you do," Veilor said, "if you were her?" Drael considered this with genuine weight. "Depends on what I had to work with. What she's got is a ruined tower, a rank that means nothing inside these walls, and a king who sent her a letter and is now apparently unable to look at anything except the building she's in." He paused. "If I were her, I'd make him come in person." Veilor stared at him. "She's not wrong to wait," Drael said simply. "You rejected her in front of 400 people. A letter is not an adequate response to that. She knows it. You know it." The silence in the war room had the specific weight of a truth that has been allowed to sit unchallenged long enough to become load-bearing. "If I go there," Veilor said, "the court will notice." "Yes." They'll read it as whatever they choose to read it as. Drayle picked up one of the reports he hadn't been looking at and set it down again. The court reads everything, my king. The question isn't whether they notice. The question is what matters more to you, their interpretation or the actual situation. Valor looked at him for a long moment. Then he turned back to the window. Get some sleep, Drayle. As you say, my king. But Drayle, leaving, allowed himself a very small smile in the direction of the door that Valor, facing the window, did not see. He went on the 9th morning. He did not tell Drayle. He did not bring guards, which was technically against his own security protocols, which he had written himself, which he now chose to regard as guidelines. He went at the hour when the compound was quiet enough that the people who noticed things were still deciding whether to be awake yet, and he walked the quarter-mile of courtyard and storage buildings in the cold morning air with his hands in the pockets of his plain coat and his wolf going very carefully still. The way it went still when something it had been tracking for a long time was close. He knocked on the tower door. This too was new. He had not knocked on a door as opposed to simply entering in a considerable number of years. His own chambers were announced by guards. Council chambers were staff cleared before he arrived. The last time he remembered actually standing in front of a closed door and waiting for someone to open it, he had been 19 years old and standing outside his father's sick room, and that memory he did not pursue further. He waited. He heard movement inside. Footsteps. Not the measured, familiar footsteps. Someone lighter, quicker. The young attendant. Till. The door opened. Till looked up at him. She was 17 and had the kind of face that showed everything happening behind it, and what was happening behind it right now was an extremely rapid reassessment of her morning. She went very still. Then she went slightly pale. Then she took a very fast, very shallow breath and said, "My king." "Lady Voss," he said. "Is she available?" Till's eyes did the thing eyes do when they are simultaneously checking over their shoulder and looking at the person in front of them. Yes, she's in the upper sitting room. Should I? Don't announce me, he said. Then, hearing himself, ask her if she'll see me. Don't announce it as a command. Ask. Till blinked at him. He understood from her expression that she was recalibrating her entire understanding of the Alpha King of Dreadmoor in real time and finding the new version confusing. "Yes, my king," she said, and disappeared up the stairs. He waited in the tower entryway. It smelled of old wood and now wood smoke and something that might have been pine oil. Someone had been cleaning the stone floor. The rug near the door was new, or newish. Small things. The kind of small things that accumulate when people are working to make a space livable because they have no other option. He stood there and felt the mate bond register her proximity with the precision of a compass needle. Above him, footsteps. The quiet, careful ones, measured and deliberate, coming down. She appeared at the top of the stairs. She was wearing a dark gray dress, simple, with her hair loose, not styled for court, not arranged for presentation. She had not known he was coming, he realized. She looked like herself in the morning, which was a thing he had no frame of reference for and which hit him somewhere undefended. She held the stair rail with one hand and came down carefully, counting the steps in the way that meant she had memorized the count and was confirming it. And when she reached the bottom, she turned toward him with the unerring accuracy of someone navigating by sound and air pressure. She stopped 4 feet away. Her pale eyes found a point approximately at his chin, which was as close to eye contact as geometry and biology would allow her, and she said nothing. He said nothing. The silence lasted long enough to have a shape. "You didn't reply to the letter," he said. "No," she said. "I didn't. I wrote that I wanted to speak with you. I know what you wrote. Then I thought about it," she said, "and I decided that if you wanted to speak with me, you knew where I was." Her voice was even. Not cold exactly. Cold implied effort, implied suppression of something warmer. This was something more than that. This was a woman who had decided with complete deliberateness how much of herself to make available to this conversation and had set the line and was standing on it. "You've known where I am for 37 days. The number landed. He had not expected her to be counting. He should have expected her to be counting. "You're right," he said. She waited. He stopped, started again. "What happened at the ceremony? How I handled it was wrong." The silence that followed was the kind of silence that tests the weight of words. Wrong, she said slowly, with the particular quality of someone turning a word over and examining its underside. Yes, wrong like a miscalculation, she said, or wrong like something else. He looked at her. She could not see him looking. This gave the act a strange quality. He could observe her without the usual defenses a person raises when they know they are being observed. She was standing at the bottom of her stairs in the cold morning air of a tower he had sent her to, and she was asking him to distinguish between categories of wrong with the precision of someone who had a great deal riding on the difference, and she was doing it without flinching. Wrong like something else, he said. Another silence. That doesn't fix it, she said. I know. Saying it doesn't fix it either. I know that too. She made a small sound that was not agreement and not disagreement. Then she said, Why are you here? It was the question he had been asking himself for 9 days. Because I owe you more than a letter. You owe me considerably more than that? Yes. She stood very still. Something moved across her face. Not the suppressed collapse he had waited for on the terrace. Not grief. Something more complex. The expression of a person reassessing a position they had taken at great cost, and finding the ground under it shifting without their permission. What do you want from this conversation, my king? The title in her mouth had an edge. Not contempt, something more specific, the sound of someone using formal language as a measuring tool. I don't know yet, he said, which was the most honest thing he had said to anyone in a very long time. Her head tilted slightly, that small adjustment of orientation, tracking him. Her nostrils moved, taking in information through channels he had no corresponding skill in, reading him by scent and air and the quality of his breath the way he read men by posture and eye movement. You smell like a bad night, she said. Several of them. He blinked. You're not sleeping, she said. It was not a question. I sleep fine. You smell like a man who's been awake at 3 a.m. for a week. She said it without drama, the way you state a fact about the weather. Your wolf is restless. I can... She stopped, pressed her lips together, continued. I can feel it, even from here. The air in the tower entryway was very still. You can feel that, he said. The bond works in both directions, she said. Even an incomplete one, even a rejected one. Her voice dropped in volume, but not in clarity. I didn't choose this. Neither did you. But it's there, and pretending otherwise hasn't helped either of us. He stood in the hallway of the eastern tower and felt the mate bond between them like a current in a river. Present, directional, not asking for permission. His wolf, which had gone still at her proximity, was now doing something he had no word for. Not pacing, not surging, something more like settling, the way an animal settles when it has been searching for a long time and has finally arrived at the place it was searching for. I'm not asking you to forgive it, he said. Good, she said. I don't. I'm asking... He stopped again. In 38 years, he had never had to ask. The empire was structured specifically so that he did not have to ask. He issued orders and the world configured itself accordingly. Standing here, asking this woman with her pale, unfocused eyes and her counted stair steps and her precise reading of his sleep deprivation through scent, he felt the full weight of how comprehensively that had failed to prepare him for this moment. I'm asking if we can start from where we are instead of where we were. What? Joa. She turned her face slightly away from him. Not dismissal. Thought. Her jaw was doing the thing he had noticed on the terrace, a slight tightening that meant she was working something through rather than just feeling it. That depends, she said finally. On what? On whether you understand why what you did was wrong. She turned back toward him. Not just strategically, not just administratively. Why it was wrong. He held her gaze, or the near approximation of it, her eyes tracking somewhere at his chin. And he thought about a woman mapping territory by footsteps and sunlight. He thought about Drael's voice saying she didn't make a sound. He thought about the number 37, counted out in days in a cold tower, and what it meant that she had kept count. Because you were a person, he said, and I treated you like a problem to be managed. The silence that followed had a different quality from the ones before it. Not testing, not measuring. Something more like the silence after a thing that needed saying has been said, and the air's adjusting to it. Yes, she said quietly. That's it. Neither of them moved. Outside the tower, the winter morning continued. Somewhere in the capital, a bell was marking the hour. Far away, the compound gates were changing their guards with the mechanical efficiency of a system that did not require any of this to function. I would like, Valor said, to come back, if you'll allow it. You don't ask permission for things, she said, not accusing, observing. I'm asking now. She stood with her hand still on the newel post of the stair, and her pale eyes finding their approximate bearing, and said nothing for long enough that he understood she was actually deciding. Not performing deliberation, actually making a choice that she had not made before he walked in. Tomorrow, she said. Same hour. We talk about the festival. He knew which festival she meant. 40 days had become 31. The Festival of Crowns. There are things happening, she said carefully, that your court is going to notice with or without your help. I would prefer... A pause. I would prefer to have one conversation with someone who has the authority to do something about it before it becomes a situation that neither of us controls. He looked at her. What kind of things? Tomorrow, she said. Same hour. She moved to the stairs. Her hand found the rail without searching for it. She was already counting steps in her head, he realized, already navigating back up before her foot had found the first one. Lady Voss, he said. She paused. The south-facing room, he said. In the residential wing. The offer stands. She was quiet for a moment. I know it does, she said. I'll think about it. She went up the stairs. He stood in the entryway until he heard her footsteps reach the top. Then he let himself out and walked back through the gray winter morning toward the palace. And his wolf, for the first time in 38 days, was not pacing. Chum. He came back the next morning. And the morning after that. The court noticed on the fourth morning, which was faster than Valor had hoped and slower than Drael had predicted. By the fifth morning, the observations had become conversations, and by the sixth, they had become the kind of structured speculation that moves through a court the way water moves through limestone, invisibly, persistently, following the path of least resistance toward whatever cavern it intends to fill. Lady Crescent noticed first, because Lady Crescent always noticed first. She was 71 years old, had survived 4 Ashran kings through the refined art of noticing things before anyone else and keeping careful score, and had a face that gave nothing away because it had given nothing away for 5 decades, and the muscles had simply given up. She said nothing to anyone for 2 days. Then she said one sentence to Lord Havert at the council dinner, which was that the Alpha King had been seen on the eastern ground 6 times in 8 days, and Lord Havert had said that was interesting and repeated it to his wife, and the limestone cave began to fill. Valor was aware of all of this and continued going anyway. This was the thing he could not have predicted. That the going, once started, would not stop. That the conversations in the cold tower sitting room, Elira across from him in her chair, him in the chair he had moved to be across from her, their 2 cups of whatever Marta brought them going gradually cold because neither of them stopped talking long enough to drink, would become something he organized his mornings around with a focus that he'd previously reserved for military campaigns. She was, he was discovering, nothing like what he had assumed. Not because his assumptions had been wrong about blindness or about Eastern minor nobility or about the specific qualities he'd assigned to frailty on the night of the ceremony. His assumptions had been wrong at a deeper level than any of those things. He had looked at her and assumed that whatever she was, it was less than what he was. He had made this assumption without examining it, which was how he had made most of his worst decisions, and he was understanding this about himself with an increasing and uncomfortable clarity. You were educated privately as, he said one morning. My father hired tutors, she said, partly because I couldn't attend the academy, partly because he believed. She stopped. A brief pause that had the quality of editing. He believed the academy curriculum was incomplete. In what way? History, mostly. The official histories. She wrapped both hands around her cup. He said the official histories of Dreadmoor were written by men who had won and had a significant investment in explaining why winning had been inevitable. He thought that was a form of lying by omission. Valor was quiet for a moment. He wasn't wrong. I know. She said it simply, without the edge it could have carried. He had a private archive. Letters, journals, records from the Eastern Territories that never made it into the Imperial collection. I read most of them. A slight pause. Twice. What did they say? She tilted her head in the way that meant she was deciding how much to share. He had learned this tell in the first 3 days. There were things she was not ready to discuss, and she was direct enough about not discussing them that he had stopped pushing, which was itself a new experience. He was accustomed to using silence as leverage, and finding that silence with Elira had no leverage function. She simply waited in it, unbothered, until the silence had passed, and they could move on. They said, she said carefully, that the power structures of the Empire have an older architecture than the current kings acknowledge, and that some of what gets called mythology is actually record. He felt something shift in him that was not quite alarm and not quite interest, but somewhere between them. What kind of record? She pressed her lips together, not refusing, measuring. What do you know, she said, about the First Star bloodlines? The silence that followed was different from the ones before it. He knew what he knew from the official archives, which was what every educated person in Dreadmoor knew. A founding myth. Ancient lineages said to carry celestial gifts. Stories told to children and recorded in the historical sections under the heading of pre-imperial cosmology, which was the Empire's way of filing things that complicated the current narrative into a category that made them sound academic and therefore ignorable. I know what the archives say, he said. Then you know very little, she said, and there was no cruelty in it, just accuracy. The official archive, she continued, describes them as extinct. The last true bloodline carrier died 200 years ago. There's a date and a formal death record, and a notation in the chronicle that the gift passed from the world. But she looked at him, looked toward him, the small correction he made automatically now in his own head. But my father's archive has a record from 140 years ago. A letter from a woman in the Eastern Territories to her daughter describing what she called the sealing, a deliberate suppression of the gift, not extinction. She paused. Concealment. The morning was very quiet. Outside the tower's south window, a bird was moving in the courtyard. Valor could hear it. He could also hear his own heartbeat, which had picked up in a way that had nothing to do with physical exertion. Elira, he said. It was the first time he had used her name. She went very still. He had not planned it. It had come out with the directness of something that has been damned for long enough and has simply found a gap in the structure. Her name in his mouth tasted like something that mattered, which was a thought he immediately filed under the category of things he would not say aloud. The fever, he said carefully. When you were 9. Her jaw tightened, the slightest movement. Yes. Was it actually a fever? The silence stretched. I don't know, she said. I know what my mother called it. I know what the physician's record says. I know what I... Another pause. Longer. I know what I remember, and what I remember is different from what the record says. What do you remember? She set her cup down. Both hands came to rest in her lap. Her pale eyes drifted in their slow, unfocused way, and for a moment she looked like the woman who had crossed the Imperial Terrace, the one he had assigned the label of fragile before she had done a single thing to earn it. And then she breathed out and she looked like herself again, which was something harder and more specific than fragile had ever been. I remember light, she said, coming from inside me, and I remember being afraid of it, and then I remember darkness, and then I remember not being able to see. She said it flatly. In that order. Outside, the bird in the courtyard made a sound and went quiet. Valor thought about the column of silver-white light above the tower in the storm. He thought about the night guard's carefully assembled expression. He thought about the mate bond in his chest, which had been doing something for the last week that he had no word for, not vibrating, something else, something with direction, like a thing orienting toward a source. He thought about what it meant that the moon goddess had made this woman his mate. He thought about what it might mean if the moon goddess had not simply made a poetic or ironic choice, but had made a structural one. What is it? Elira said, reading his silence the way she read everything. I need to show you something, he said. She waited. Not now, he said. I need to get it from the archive, the restricted collection. There's a document I've had sealed since I inherited the throne because my father sealed it, and I never questioned why. He stood. I'm going to unseal it. What kind of document? A survey, he said. From the Northern Intelligence Corps, written 40 years ago, about anomalous phenomena in the Eastern Territories. He paused at the door, looking back at her. She was sitting in her chair with her hands in her lap, and her blind eyes aimed at the space where he had been sitting, and in the light from the south window her skin had the particular quality of... He stopped the thought. I'll be back this afternoon. Valor, she said. His own name stopped him at the door. She had not used it before. He had used hers once, and it had changed the gravity of the room. She using his did something similar. Be careful who sees you pull that file, she said. He looked at her. Why? Because, she said carefully, there are people in your court who will already be asking questions about why you've been coming here, and some of them will be asking those questions for reasons that aren't about the two of us. She paused. Some of them will be asking because they have their own reasons to want to know what's in the Eastern bloodline records. He stood in the doorway of the Eastern Tower with the cold air coming in at his back and looked at a woman who had been sitting in this tower for 39 days and had been thinking the whole time. How long, he said, have you known there were factions in the court with an interest in your bloodline? Since before I came to Dreadmoor, she said. Since the summons arrived. She turned her face toward the south window. My father's archive didn't just have records about the bloodline. It had records about who had been looking for it. The morning light came through the south window and fell across her face, and Valor stood very still and understood, with the slow and irreversible clarity of a man who has spent 40 days looking at a situation from the wrong angle and has just finally turned his head that the woman he had rejected for weakness was the most politically consequential person in his empire. And she had known. She had known when she crossed his terrace. She had known when he said no. She had stood there and taken it and counted 39 days and waited because she had needed to know, before she told him any of this, whether he was capable of being the kind of man you could tell it to. He had spent 40 days auditing for that, without knowing he was being evaluated. You were deciding, he said, whether I was worth trusting, she said. Yes. He was quiet. And, he said. She turned her face back toward him. Her pale eyes found their approximate bearing just below his own. You're here, she said. Aren't you? He pulled the file himself from the restricted archive, which required his personal seal and the dismissal of the two archive attendants who were present, both of whom left with the practiced blankness of people who understood that what they had not seen could not require explanation. The document was 42 years old, bound in plain leather, 19 pages in an intelligence officer's cramped, precise handwriting, the kind of penmanship that came from men trained to record quickly and accurately under conditions where there was no time for anything but clarity. The survey covered a 3-year period of anomalous reports from the Eastern Territories. Villages describing lights in the sky that moved against the wind, crops that grew in geometric patterns with no agricultural explanation, 2 separate accounts of children born with what the surveyor carefully called unusual optical characteristics, eyes described, in both cases, by local witnesses as containing light that moved independently of available illumination. In the margin of page 14, someone had written in a different hand, in red ink, Origin confirmed. Eastern bloodline dormant but present. Recommend continued monitoring and containment as necessary. The word containment was underlined twice. Below it, in the same red ink, a name. Not a name Valor recognized from the current court, but a name he recognized from the genealogical records of one of the Empire's oldest and most powerful noble houses. A house that still held 3 seats on the Imperial Council. A house whose current patriarch had, at the ceremony 40 days ago, been standing in the 3rd row of the assembled court and had been, Valor now recalled with the focused precision of a man retrospectively examining a battlefield, watching Alira cross the terrace with an expression that was not the expression of a man witnessing something unexpected. It was the expression of a man watching something he had been expecting for a very long time. He closed the file. He sat in the restricted archive with his hand flat on the leather cover and felt his wolf go from still to alert in the space of a breath. The mate bond in his chest, which he had been learning to read the way you learn to read a new instrument, imperfectly, with increasing confidence, was doing something that required no interpretation. It was telling him she was in danger. Not new danger, old danger. Danger that had been in place since before she arrived, that had waited with patience while he made his miscalculations and wasted his 40 days, that had been moving its pieces on a board he hadn't known he was playing on. He stood up. He was out of the archive and moving through the palace corridor toward the eastern compound at a pace that was not quite a run, which was a distinction he maintained purely by discipline when he heard it, not heard, felt, through the mate bond with a clarity that stripped away every ambiguity he'd been carrying about what the bond meant and what he was going to do about it. Sharp, sudden absence. The warmth that had been sitting in his chest for 40 days, the steady current of her proximity, the compass needle that had been pointing east every moment since the terrace, it spiked. Then it cut out. He ran. The eastern tower's front door stood open. Marta was on the step, on her knees, both hands pressed to her face. Not injured. Shock. The old woman looked up at him as he arrived and said his name the way people say things when they have no other words available. Till was behind her, standing very straight, very pale, with her hands twisted together and her eyes going to the tower interior and back to him with the repetitive movement of someone stuck between action and paralysis. He took the stairs 3 at a time. The upper sitting room was empty. The chair where she always sat was not quite in its usual position, displaced slightly, as if someone had moved it, or as if someone standing near it had caused it to shift. The window was closed. The fire had burned to low coals. Her cup from the morning was still on the table beside the chair. On the floor, in the space between the chair and the window, there were marks. He crouched. Fine lines burned into the old wooden floorboards. Silver white, still faintly warm when he held his hand close without touching. The pattern was not random. It radiated outward from a central point, the place where she would have been standing, in lines that curved and crossed in a way his eyes kept wanting to read as language and couldn't quite resolve into it. He pressed 2 fingers to the nearest line. The warmth came up through his fingertips like touching a wire that carries current. His wolf lurched in his chest with an intensity that was almost physical pain, and through the mate bond, the incomplete, rejected, inconvenient mate bond that had been patiently insisting on its own reality for 40 days, he felt her, far, moving, and beneath that feeling, underneath the distance and the direction, something vast and awake, and not entirely human, and her at the center of it, not drowning, but not entirely in control either, fighting toward a surface she couldn't see from inside the water. He stood up. He turned to the window. Through the glass, above the capital's eastern wall, in the sky above the ridgeline, a star was burning in broad daylight. Not faintly, not ambiguously. Burning. Veilor looked at it for exactly 3 seconds. The amount of time it took for the full picture to assemble itself with the clarity of something that has always been true and has finally stopped waiting for permission to be acknowledged. She had not been taken. She had been triggered, and whoever had triggered her had not understood, had calculated wrong, had moved too early or too late or with too much force, that the thing they were trying to use as a weapon did not want to be a weapon. He turned from the window. The war room, his fastest guards, the restricted file with the red ink name. It was all one chain of decisions, and the first link was already made, had been made somewhere between the archive and the stairs of this tower, somewhere in the space where the bond had cut out and he had started running. He was done calculating. He moved. The name in the file was Craveth. Lord Soren Craveth, Patriarch of House Craveth, holder of the Eastern Council seat, his grandfather had purchased through a land consolidation that the Imperial Archive described as a negotiated settlement, and the Eastern Territories described, in the private records Alira's father had kept, as something closer to extortion. 3 seats on the council. Controlling interest in 2 of the Empire's largest grain routes. A family history that stretched back far enough to have been present at the founding wars, which meant a family history that was long enough to have been watching the Eastern bloodlines since before anyone thought to call it watching. Veilor had the file under his arm when he reached Drael. He did not explain. He handed it over, marked to page 14, and watched the old commander's face as he read. Drael read the way he did everything. Without visible reaction, his eyes moving steadily line by line, his scar catching the corridor light. When he reached the margin notation, he went very still. "How long have you had this?" Drael said. 42 years it sat sealed, Veilor said. My father sealed it. Your father may not have known what he was sealing, or he knew exactly what he was sealing. Veilor moved. Drael fell into step beside him without being asked. I need Kravith's movements for the last 40 days. Every meeting, every communication, every... I can get that, Drael said. How fast do you need it? I need it before he knows I'm looking. Then I have about 4 hours. Drael's voice was flat. The morning court session ends at midday. He'll be in the Eastern Council chamber until then, and his personal secretary will be managing his correspondence. After midday, he'll know I pulled the file. Veilor stopped at the corridor junction. The palace was moving around them at its normal morning pace, staff and guards and attendants. The machinery of imperial administration indifferent to what was burning in the eastern sky. Where would they take her? Drael did not ask who. Not the city. Too visible, too many of your people. Too hard to control what she... He paused, chose his words. What she might do, if she's already awake. He said awake the way you say a word you're not sure is accurate but can't find a better one for. The Kravith holdings outside the capital. There's a compound in the Ashfen foothills, 2 hours east. Old structure. The family uses it for hunting, officially. You already knew about it. I know about most things, Drael said. I just don't always know which ones matter until they do. Veilor looked at him. You knew about Kravith? I knew he was watching her. I didn't know he was going to move. A pause. The specific quality of a man measuring the distance between what he'd calculated and what had actually happened. I thought he'd wait until after the festival. Too many eyes before then. He didn't wait. No. The corridor was very quiet for a moment. He moved because I went to the tower, Veilor said. Drael said nothing. He was watching to see if I'd leave her isolated, Veilor said. And when I didn't, he decided he needed to move her before you decided what to do about her. Drael held the file. He's had 40 years of preparation, my king, at minimum. Whatever his family has been planning around the Eastern bloodline didn't start with you. Veilor thought about a woman sitting in a cold tower counting 37 days, keeping her father's archive in her head because she had no other place to keep it, mapping territory and footsteps, deciding slowly and with absolute deliberateness whether the Alpha King who had rejected her was worth telling the truth to. She had known Kravith was looking for her. She had said as much. She had been trying to tell him yesterday, careful, pacing it for what he could receive, and he had left to pull the file, and she had been sitting in that tower alone, and Kravith had not waited for him to come back. 4 hours, Veilor said. Get me the compound's layout. I want guards who aren't on Kravith's council rotation. There's a complication, Drael said. Of course there was. She's not... Drael paused. Whatever is happening to her, my king. Whatever woke up. We don't know what condition she'll be in when you reach her. We don't know what condition the people around her will be in. He said it carefully, with the precision of a man making sure the king he serves understands something important before committing to a course of action. She may not need rescuing in the way we're imagining. Veilor thought about the marks on the tower floor, the warmth of them under his fingers, the star burning in daylight sky. I know. Then what is this, Drael said. Tactically. Tactically, Veilor said. It's damage control. Whatever Kravith triggered, he triggered in the middle of my empire, and that makes it my problem regardless of what she does or doesn't need from me. He started moving again, and personally, he stopped. Drael waited. Personally, Veilor said, I'm not leaving her with the man who's been hunting her bloodline for 40 years while I stand in a palace corridor, figuring out my position. Drael made a sound that was not quite approval and not quite relief, but had elements of both. I'll have the layout in 2 hours, he said, and I'll have the guard roster ready. He moved off down the corridor, already thinking 3 steps ahead, already pulling at threads in the institutional fabric of the empire that only someone who had lived inside it for 30 years would know how to pull. Veilor went to the war room. He spread maps. He did the thing he was actually good at, the thing that 20 years of difficult decisions had built in him until it was more reflex than process. He read the terrain, identified the variables, mapped the failure points, and planned for a situation in which at least half of what he planned for would be wrong. He did not think about the bond being cut. He could not afford to think about it directly. He filed it in the category of things that would be addressed when he arrived and assessed, and he kept his hands steady on the maps and his mind on the work. Through the war room's eastern window, the star in the daylight sky had not gone out. They left the capital at midday with 12 men, none of them in imperial colors. Veilor's decision, and a calculated one. House. Craveth had 3 council seats and 40 years of preparation, which meant it also had eyes inside the palace, eyes on the gate guards, eyes on the morning dispatch riders. A formal military column riding east in imperial colors would be tracked from the moment it left the gate. 12 men in plain riding clothes, leaving through the tradesman's exit on the western side and circling north before turning east, had a better chance of arriving before anyone thought to send warning. Better chance, not certainty. Nothing about this was certain. Drayle rode beside him. He had brought the compound layout, a hand-drawn sketch that had the quality of something reconstructed from intelligence rather than surveyed directly, with 3 areas marked as uncertain and 1 section of the eastern wall noted as recently repaired, which meant recently reinforced, which meant someone had been expecting to need it. The compound sat in the first fold of the Ashvin foothills, sheltered on 2 sides by rock faces and accessible by 1 road and 1 secondary track that the sketch marked as passable by horse in dry conditions and questionable in wet. It had been wet for a week. The track was questionable. "He'll have men," Veilor said, not for the first time, working it aloud because that was how he processed terrain. 8 to 12, I'd estimate, Drayle said. House Craveth has a private security retinue of about 20, but he couldn't move all of them without it being noticed. He'll have brought half. And he won't be expecting us this fast. He'll be expecting you eventually, Drayle said. He's not stupid, but eventually and midday the same day are different things. So we have the surprise and they have the position. Yes, that's fine. It was, in fact, fine. Position and surprise were a standard trait in his experience. Surprise, properly used, was worth more than position in the first 60 seconds of a situation, and 60 seconds was often all you needed. What he didn't say, and what Drayle knew without it being said, was that the wild variable in this particular trade was the woman at the center of it, who might not be in a condition to be retrieved, who might, if what he'd felt through the bond was accurate, be in a condition that made both position and surprise irrelevant in ways that neither of them had experience planning for. They reached the foothills in just under 2 hours, which was faster than the horses should have managed, and which Veilor attributed to the particular focus that comes over men who are riding towards something that matters. The secondary track was indeed questionable, but questionable turned out to mean uneven and muddy rather than impassable, and they navigated it single file with the horses picking their way carefully and the afternoon light cutting flat and cold through the tree cover. Veilor smelled the compound before he saw it. Wood smoke. Horse. Something underneath both that was sharp and chemical and wrong in the way that smells are wrong when they shouldn't be there. Burning stone. That was what it was. The smell of heated rock. He held up his fist. The column stopped. You smell that, Drayle said quietly. Yes. That's not a fireplace. No. They moved to the tree line and looked at the compound. It was a substantial structure for a hunting property. 2-story main building, a separate stable block, the recently repaired eastern wall running around the perimeter. It was also, from the tree line, visibly under a level of internal stress that it had not been designed for. 3 of the windows in the main building were dark with soot. The eastern wall, the repaired one, had a crack running from the top parapet to the ground that was new enough that the stone edges were still pale. 2 horses were loose in the outer yard, saddled and reined but with no riders, moving in the tight, anxious circles of horses that want to be somewhere else. Of the 8 to 12 men Drayle had estimated, 4 were visible in the yard, 2 near the main gate, all of them positioned in the posture of people who have been told to hold a perimeter and are increasingly unsure what they're holding a perimeter against. The other 4 to 8 were inside, or they had been. She's awake, Drayle said. She's been awake, Veilor said. Something changed. He did not use the word escalated because what he was looking at was beyond escalation. The compound was under internal pressure from something that had started inside and was working outward, and the men in the yard were not people holding a prisoner. They were people who had gotten very far from whatever they'd planned for, and were now making tactical calculations about whether staying was rational. Veilor made the decision without discussion. He turned to his 12 men, looked at each face briefly, the quick assessment of a commander checking his tools before using them, and said, "Take the gate guards without noise. The 4 in the yard, I want contained, not dead, because I want to know what they were told." He looked at Drael. "You and I go in." Drael nodded. He had not asked whether this was the correct approach. He understood that the 12 men for the yard and the 2 for the interior was not a confidence calculation. It was the acknowledgement that whatever was happening inside that building required exactly 2 people and no more, one who had authority to negotiate, and one who had spent 30 years knowing when authority was enough and when it wasn't. The gate guards were handled with the quiet professionalism of men who were good at their work and took it seriously. One sound, briefly, cut off. Then the yard gate was open, and Veilor was moving across the outer yard toward the main building's entrance, and the 4 men in the yard were registering the arrival of 12 armed strangers with the paralyzed calculation of people who had already decided their employer's odds were poor and were in the process of updating that assessment to worse. None of them reached for a weapon. Smart, Veilor thought, and a data point. The main building's front door was open. Veilor went through it with Drael a step behind and his hand on the hilt of the short blade at his hip. Not drawn, but there, in the specific ready state of a man who knows what he has available and hasn't decided yet whether he needs it. The entry hall was empty. The smell of burned stone was stronger inside, layered over something else now, something like lightning, the specific ionized sharpness of air after a strike. The walls of the hall were fine, the floor was fine. But at the far end of the hall, the door to the interior had been removed from its hinges and was lying in the corridor. Not forced. Removed. Cleanly. In the way that a door is removed when the thing exiting through it has no interest in the door, and the door simply cannot be in the way anymore. He went through. The interior room had been a sitting room. Heavy furniture, good wood, the kind of space a wealthy family maintains in a secondary property for the specific purpose of impressing visitors who come to this secondary property because there are conversations that cannot happen in the primary one. 2 of the windows were blown out, glass gone, frames intact, simply empty, as if the pressure had gone outward at speed and taken everything fragile with it. The fireplace on the far wall had split up its center, not by impact but by heat. The stone expanded past its tolerance from something that had been neither fire nor explosion, but had some properties of both. On the floor, in the center of the room, in a rough circle that radiated outward from a central point in lines Veilor recognized from the tower floorboards, were burn marks. Silver white, cooling now, but still throwing faint light at the edges. 5 feet from the edge of the circle, Lord Soren Kraveth was sitting with his back against the far wall and his hands in his lap, and the expression of a man who has run a very long calculation and arrived at an answer he had not planned for. He was not injured. He was also not, by any measure Veilor could read, in control of the situation. Standing, not sitting, not collapsed, standing with her hands at her sides and her back to the door, was Elira. Her hair was loose, her gray dress was unmarked, which was the most disorienting detail in the room, because everything around her was marked. Everything had been touched by whatever she'd put out, and she was standing in the middle of it like the eye of it, still and contained. Her eyes were open. They were silver. Not pale gray. Not the unfocused pale he'd learned over 40 days of morning conversations. Silver, lit from inside, the light steady and directional, like something that had been behind a door for a very long time and had finally stopped waiting for the door to be opened and had simply taken the door apart. She turned her head when Veilor came through. She turned it with the precision of someone who can see. "You're late," she said. Her voice was hers. Exactly hers. That was the thing he held on to, the thing he marked as important for when he needed to tell someone about this moment. Her voice was completely hers. Not larger, not resonant with anything that wasn't Elira Voss. Just Elira Voss standing in a room she had taken apart, telling him he was late. "I was 2 hours," he said. "I know exactly how long you were," she said. He looked at Kraveth. Kraveth looked back at him with the expression of a man who has been outmaneuvered not by a superior force, but by a fundamental misunderstanding of what he was dealing with. He was in his 60s, Kraveth, and had the broad, settled look of a man who has been powerful for long enough to have forgotten that there were other ways to be. He did not look frightened. He looked recalculating, still calculating. Even here, that told Valor something. "Lord Kraveth," he said. "My king." Kraveth's voice was steady, experienced. "I can explain the circumstances." "I'm sure you can," Valor said. "I'm not interested in your explanation. I'm interested in what you told your men before you brought her here." A pause. "My men were given necessary instructions." "Your men," Valor said, "are currently being detained in your yard by 12 of mine, and they surrendered without incident, which means they were told enough to know that fighting wasn't in their interest, but not enough to know why she was worth the risk." He moved into the room, not toward Kraveth, toward Elira, not reaching for her, stopping at a distance that was close enough to be clear and far enough to be her choice. "What did you tell them she was?" Kraveth was quiet. "A resource," Elira said. She had not moved. "He told them she was a resource that had been neglected by the Empire and needed to be properly managed." Her voice carried the flat quality of someone repeating words they have had time to process. He was quite specific about the language. Resource, management, not prisoner. He's been careful about language for a long time. Valor looked at Kraveth. 40 years. Kraveth's jaw tightened. A small movement, the first crack in the surface. "The bloodline is an imperial asset. She's a person," Valor said. The room went quiet. He had not planned to say it like that. He had planned a version of this conversation that was political, that addressed the treason component and the council implications and the specific legal framework under which Kraveth's actions constituted a crime against the imperial crown. He had that version ready. He had written its structure in his head during the 2-hour ride. What came out instead was 3 words, flat and unambiguous, and he did not regret them. Kraveth stared at him. "She's a person," Valor said again, because it had been true the first time and was still true. "And you moved against her inside my empire without my sanction, and whatever rationale you've been building for 40 years for why that's acceptable, I'm going to need you to understand right now that it isn't." "With respect," Kraveth said, with the careful tone of a man playing his last viable card, "the king who rejected a fated mate on the ceremonial terrace is an unusual advocate for—" "Yes," Valor said. "He is." Silence. "He's also the king," Valor said, "and you're under arrest." Getting Kraveth out of the compound took 40 minutes and required none of the force Valor had allocated for the possibility. The man was shrewd enough to understand that resistance at this point served nothing, and that his best remaining position was legal and political: council seats, family connections, the specific machinery of imperial law that wealthy men had spent generations greasing in their own favor. He was calculating his way through his arrest with the professionalism of someone who has planned for adverse outcomes. Valor let him calculate. Let him feel like the calculation was still available to him. There would be time for Kraveth to understand the full scope of what had happened, and that time was not now and not here. He dealt with the practical elements. His 12 men managing the Kraveth retinue, Betrayal organizing the ride back, the compound secured and its contents inventoried because the compound's contents were going to be evidence, and evidence required chain of custody. He moved through these tasks with the efficiency of a man who has dealt with the aftermath of operations before and understands that the aftermath is where most things are decided. Through all of it, Elira stood near the blown-out window in the sitting room and said nothing and looked at things. She looked at things. He came back to her when the practical elements were handled. She had not moved from the window. She was standing with her face slightly raised toward the afternoon light, and her eyes, the silver had faded, he saw, receding slowly, the pale gray returning at the edges, were tracking, following, reading the yard and the tree line and the mountain sky with the deliberate attention of someone learning to use something that has never been available before. "How long, he said quietly. She knew what he meant. "It started in the tower, the morning after you came the first time." She didn't look at him. She was watching a bird cross the yard, watching it with her eyes, tracking it. Her jaw was held very carefully. "It's been getting stronger. I could see shapes, then outlines, then—" She stopped. "It's not consistent. It comes and goes. When I used it here, it was—" Another stop. "It was a lot." "What did he do to trigger it?" Her jaw tightened. He threatened Marta. She said it simply. He brought his men to the tower while I was upstairs. He had someone bring Marta to the doorway and told me that my cooperation was in my interest and that of my household. She paused. He said it politely. He's been polite for 40 years, but what he meant was clear. Valor stood at the edge of what she was describing and said nothing for a moment. And then, he said. And then I was done being managed, she said. He looked at the blown-out windows, the cracked fireplace, the burn marks on the floor and their radiating silver lines. He thought about the word that had been written in red ink in a 42-year-old file. Containment. He thought about the quality of miscalculation involved in threatening a woman's elderly attendant and expecting the response to be cooperation. He had no idea, Valor said. He had a theory, she said, about what I was, about what the bloodline could do under the right conditions. He's been building that theory for 4 decades from documents and reports and second-hand accounts. She turned from the window. Her eyes found him. Found him. Not approximately, not at his chin. Found his face. The silver was still there, faint, at the edges of her irises. His theory had a lot of things right, and one thing completely wrong. What did he get wrong? He thought it was a power that could be directed by someone else, she said. Contained, managed, aimed. He thought if he controlled the conditions, he could control the output. She looked at him steadily. It was the first time she had looked at him directly, and he understood, standing there, that he needed to hold still for it. Not because it was threatening, but because it wasn't. Because she was seeing him in a way she had not been able to before, and he owed her the stillness to do it without him moving away. He was wrong. Yes, Valor said. It's not a weapon, she said. It doesn't work like that. It's more like... She paused. You know how water doesn't aim itself? It just moves toward the lowest point available. It just does what its nature tells it to do. And its nature. She was quiet for a moment. The afternoon light came through the empty window frame and fell across her face, and her eyes with their receding silver tracked it, followed it, learning the light the way she had learned everything, with complete attention and the patience of someone for whom nothing has ever been easy, and who has therefore become very good at the things that require difficulty. The marks started on my arms, she said. When I was 9, the fever suppressed them. She paused. Someone sealed them. I don't know who, I don't know how. I'm working on understanding the rest of what my father's archive was telling me, but it will take time. We have time, he said. She looked at him, that direct silver-edged look. Do we? Yes, he said. We do. She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she looked back out the empty window at the yard where Drael was organizing the logistics of the return, and the horses were being brought around and the afternoon was sliding toward evening with the indifference of an afternoon that has no stake in human outcomes. The Festival of Crowns is in 31 days, she said. 30, he said. It's past midday. And Craveth has 3 council seats. He did, until this morning. His family still has allies, people who've been invested in this since before Craveth. He's not the whole structure, he's just the visible part. She said it with the precision of someone who has been thinking about this for considerably longer than the afternoon. Arresting him will pull on threads. Things will move. I know. Things may move faster than 30 days. He looked at her. What are you saying? She turned from the window and faced him fully. Her feet were steady on the ruined floor. Her hands were at her sides. She was not performing composure. She was composed, in the way that a thing is what it is because that is its nature, and her nature had been in the process of revealing itself with increasing force for the last 40 days, and had today made a substantial public announcement. I'm saying, she said quietly, that what happened here today is not something that gets contained. Craveth's men were in that yard. They'll talk eventually to someone. Accounts get out. The festival has every major noble house in the empire in attendance. She paused. And I am not going to spend the Festival of Crowns in the Eastern Tower. The statement sat between them. He said, No, you're not. She waited. You'll take the south-facing rooms, he said, in the residential wing. As Lady Voss, holder of a mating bond recognized by the ancient pact, incomplete or otherwise, it's on record and it carries standing. He paused. The court will have questions. Let them, she said. It was exactly what he had said to Drayle days ago, and she could not have known that. And yet, he almost smiled. Almost. "We should ride before dark," Drayle called from the yard, with the specific tone of a man who is giving his king time, and is also making clear that time has a practical limit. Vaelor looked at Elira. She was already turning from the window, already moving toward the door, with the careful deliberateness of someone relearning what her body can do and unwilling to rush it. She passed him. Close. Closer than she had allowed in 40 days of morning conversations. The mate bond, the incomplete, rejected, inconvenient mate bond, registered it with the full focused attention it had been bringing to bear on everything for 40 days, and his wolf went very still in the specific way of an animal that has decided the searching is over. He fell into step beside her. They walked out of the compound into the late afternoon light. Behind them, the burned room sat quiet, its silver marks cooling toward the color of old ash, the empty window frames holding sky. They were 2 miles from the capital when the second star appeared. Not above the eastern tower, not behind them, in the direction of the Ashvin foothills, above the capital itself, above the palace. Vaelor pulled his horse up. Around him, his 12 men did the same. Drayle was already looking, his hand shading his eyes against the angle of the evening light, his face doing the thing it did when he was categorizing something his experience had no file for. Elira's horse had stopped without her pulling the reins. She was looking up, both eyes. Silver, fully, the pale gray swallowed entirely by the light that had been in her since she was 9 years old and had spent that many years behind a sealed door. She was looking at the star above the palace with the expression of a woman recognizing something. "That's not mine," she said. The words landed in the group like a stone. Vaelor stared at the star, then at her. "What do you mean that's not—" "The one this morning," she said. "Above the tower. That was mine. The one above the compound. Mine." She did not look away from the capital. "That one is not mine." His wolf slammed against the inside of his ribs with a force that was nothing like the steady pacing of 40 days. This was alarm. Pure, clarifying, with the specific quality of a predator that has just realized the thing it came out to hunt is not the only predator in the territory. "Someone else," he said. "Another bloodline," she said. She finally looked at him. Her silver eyes were completely steady, which was in some ways more alarming than if they hadn't been. "Vaelor, there's another one, and they're already inside the palace." The star above the capital burned in the darkening sky, steady and cold, and completely indifferent to the fact that everything that had been moving toward resolution had just, in a single breathtaking instant, become something else entirely. And below it, in the palace that Vaelor had ruled for 20 years, something was waiting that none of them had planned for, that Kravith's 40 years of preparation had apparently not included, that had been inside the walls the entire time, and had just decided, watching the events of the afternoon from whatever position it occupied in the imperial court, to announce itself. Vaelor's hand closed on his reins. "Ride," he said. They rode hard. 2 miles of road between them and the capital, the evening collapsing fast into the kind of dark that comes when the light has somewhere else to be. And Vaelor pushed his horse through it with the focused aggression of a man who has done the calculation and found only one acceptable answer. Behind him, his 12 men kept pace without complaint. Drayle rode on his left, silent, watching the star above the palace with the expression of someone revising every assumption they came in with. Elira rode on his right. She had not spoken since the 2 words that had reordered everything. She rode straight, both hands on the reins, her silver eyes tracking the star with the attention of a woman trying to read something written in a language she is still learning. "Can you tell anything from it?" Vaelor said. Not a gentle question, a tactical one. "It's older than mine," she said. "The quality of it. Steadier." She paused. "More controlled, which means someone who's been awake longer." "Yes. And inside the palace." "Inside the palace," she confirmed. "Somewhere in the central structure, the main hall or close to it." He thought about the Festival of Crowns prep. The palace for 2 weeks had been receiving delegations, representatives, advance parties from every major house in the empire, hundreds of additional people moving through the residential wings, the formal halls, the staff corridors. Any one of them could have walked in with an agenda that had nothing to do with the festival and everything to do with what Ilara represented. Except it wasn't any one of them. It was someone specific, someone who had waited until the Kravith situation moved, waited until Vialor rode east, waited until the palace's attention was directed at the compound in the Ashfin foothills, waited for the room to be clear. Drael, Valor said. Thinking the same thing, Drael said. Who was scheduled in the main hall today? Morning session, Eastern Trade Representatives. Midday, the Halveth delegation. They arrived yesterday, 4 members plus staff. A pause. After midday, the hall was supposed to be cleared for festival prep. Supposed to be. Yes. Valor said nothing else. He leaned into the horse and rode. The capital gates were open for another hour. The evening closure was standard procedure and had nothing to do with what was burning above it. The gate guard saw the king coming at speed and did the correct thing, which was to get out of the way and send a runner ahead. By the time Valor's group cleared the gate and turned for the palace road, 3 more guards had fallen in behind them, and by the time they hit the palace courtyard, there were enough bodies moving in enough directions that the machinery of the imperial response was already grinding into motion without anyone having issued specific orders, because 20 years of Valor's command style had produced a staff that could read the temperature of his arrival and act accordingly. He dismounted before the horse had fully stopped, handed the reins to whoever was close enough to take them, moved for the main entrance. Ilara was beside him. She had dismounted with the careful precision of someone who is managing a new sensory landscape in real time and refusing to let it slow her down. He did not tell her to stay back. He understood without discussing it that telling her to stay back was not a sentence available to him in this situation, and that even if it were, she would receive it with the same quality of response she had given Kraveth's men, which was to say, not the response anyone had planned for. They went in together. Charteb. The main hall of the imperial palace was a long room with a vaulted ceiling and a floor of dark stone that had been polished to a reflective quality over 6 generations of use. It could hold 300 people for formal occasions. Tonight it held 12. Valor counted them from the entrance in the 2 seconds before anyone moved. 8 were palace staff, 3 guards, 2 attendants, 3 of the festival preparation workers who had evidently been in the middle of moving furniture when whatever happened had stopped them from moving it further. They were positioned around the edges of the hall with the specific stillness of people who have been told, very clearly, not to move. 3 were unfamiliar. Delegation members, by their clothing, the formal wear of a northern house, dark blue and gray, the kind of clothing that traveled well. They were standing in the middle section of the hall, and their posture had the quality of people who are associated with a situation they have decided they are not responsible for. The 12th was at the far end, standing at the base of the imperial dais. Valor had 2 seconds to look at her before she turned, and in those 2 seconds he registered, female, older than Illyra by perhaps 10 years, dark-haired, wearing a northern traveling coat over court clothes, standing with the quality of stillness that Valor recognized from Illyra. The stillness of someone managing something large and keeping it controlled, not because it was easy, but because they had been doing it long enough to make it look that way. She turned. Her eyes were silver, not the receding silver of Illyra in the aftermath of the compound. Full, steady, lit from within, and making no effort to conceal it. She looked at Valor across the length of the imperial hall with an expression that was not hostile and not deferential and not any of the things that people usually arrange their faces into when the Alpha King of Dreadmoor walked into the room. She looked like someone who had been waiting and was now, with some relief, done waiting. Then she looked at Illyra. Something shifted in the hall. Not physical, atmospheric. The quality of the air changed the way air changes before a storm. That specific pressure drop that the body registers before the mind is caught up to it. Valor's wolf slammed to full alert. Beside him, he felt Illyra stop breathing for 1 full second. Then Illyra said, in a voice that was very careful and very quiet, "You're the other one." "Yes," the woman said. Her voice carried the hall easily, not raised, simply projecting with the naturalness of someone accustomed to rooms. "I've been looking for you for 11 years. Valor's hand moved to his blade. The 3 northern delegation members shifted, not aggressive, but noting it. "Don't," Illyra said quietly to him. Not a command. Something more specific than that. A piece of information. Her hand found his arm, briefly, the first time she had touched him with that quality of intention, and then released it. She's not the threat. She's standing on my dais, Valor said. I know. Illyra moved past him toward the woman. 3 steps. 5. She stopped in the center of the hall. Who are you? My name is Sorvain, the woman said. House Delrath, Northern Territories. My mother's mother was Eastern-born. Her mother was from the original Voss bloodline. She paused. The same line as yours. Different branch. The hall was very quiet. The sealing, Illyra said, was applied to both branches, Sorvain said. Yours more completely. The Eastern branch carried the primary gift. The Northern branch carried a lesser version, enough to be useful, not enough to be obvious. But Saritko Ukhares Kis. She looked at Illyra with the directness of someone who has rehearsed this conversation in their head for a very long time and is now delivering it to the actual person it was meant for. I've been awake for 11 years, managing it alone, watching for the Eastern branch to surface. Her jaw tightened slightly. I was hoping to reach you before Kraveth did. You were too late, Illyra said. Yes. Sorvain looked at the empty air between them with the expression of genuine regret, which was the expression of a person who carries the specific weight of being too late for something that mattered. I know. I'm sorry. Valor had been reading this exchange with the part of his mind that operated like a compass on enemy territory, constant, directional, noting every deviation. The Northern delegation. Sorvain's controlled presentation. The staff held in place but not harmed. The deliberate choice of the main hall, the most visible, most accountable space in the palace. This was not a hostile incursion. This was a statement of presence. Someone announcing themselves in the most legible way available. You could have sent a letter, he said. Sorvain looked at him for the first time since the initial glance. Letters get intercepted, she said. Particularly letters containing information that Kraveth's network has been filtering for 40 years. She moved down from the dais, 3 steps, no performance in it, just descending, and stopped at a distance that was formal and deliberate. I came because the star above the compound this afternoon was visible from here, and because it told me she was awake, fully, and that meant there was no more time for cautious approaches. What does fully awake mean? Valor said. Specifically. Sorvain looked at Illyra. Illyra said nothing, but her head turned slightly towards Sorvain in the angle of someone waiting for information they don't have and need. It means the Festival of Crowns is no longer an ordinary event, Sorvain said. It means that every person in this empire who knows what the Eastern bloodline is and has been waiting for it to surface has received their signal tonight. She looked at Valor steadily. You arrested Kraveth. His network will know within hours. The people who have been waiting for the bloodline to appear and want to control it, some of whom are more dangerous than Kraveth, will move now, because they have to, before you consolidate. How many factions? Valor said. 3 that I know of, Sorvain said. Possibly 4. Kraveth's was the most patient. The others are less organized but more willing to use force. Valor looked at Drael. Drael looked back with the expression of a man who is performing very rapid arithmetic. 30 days until the festival, Drael said. They won't wait 30 days, Sorvain said. Not now. You have at best until the council convenes in the morning, and Kraveth's arrest becomes official record. After that, the calculation changes for everyone who's been holding position. She paused. You have one night to consolidate, to position, to draw the lines in a way that the factions who moved against those lines would be moving against the imperial crown with witnesses, in the open, rather than in the dark architecture of back-channel influence and intercepted letters. Valor understood this with the speed of a man who had been making these calculations his entire adult life. He understood it, and simultaneously understood that it was not a calculation that could be run the way he had run every calculation before it, because every calculation before it had been run from a position of complete control over his own variables, and his primary variable tonight was standing in the center of the Imperial Hall with silver fading at the edges of her eyes and the specific expression of someone processing a great deal of information very fast. He moved to stand beside her. Not in front. Beside. What do you need? He said. quietly, for her, not the room. She turned her face toward him. The silver caught the hall's lamplight and then receded another degree, the gray returning, but slowly, and he understood that it was not going away the way it had before. It was settling, finding a level. The way a river settles after a flood, lower, but changed in its course. "I need to know," she said, equally quiet, "what you're going to do in the morning, when the council convenes." "What I'm going to do," he said, "is present the charge against Craveth and request the council's formal review, which under imperial law requires all 3 of his seats be suspended pending investigation." "That forces the others to declare," she said. "Yes." "In front of each other." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment, thinking at a speed he could read now, not from her face but from the quality of her stillness. "And me," she said. "What is my position when you walk into that council chamber?" He looked at her. The hall around them, Sorvain, the staff, Drayle, the northern delegation, all of it at a remove that was partly physical distance and partly the specific privacy that certain conversations demand, regardless of how many people are present. "You're my mate," he said. She held very still. "The bond is on record," he said. "It was never dissolved. I attempted to decline it, and the ancient pact doesn't provide for that. You told me as much. The ritual official told me as much, and I ignored it because I was wrong." He held her gaze. "I'm not asking you to be a political position. I'm telling you what I'm going to tell the council." "There's a difference," she said carefully, "between what you tell the council and what is actually true. I know that. So which is this?" He had never in 20 years been asked to account for himself in this particular way. Not by a council that feared him, not by a general who respected him, not by an old commander who understood him. By the one person who had been counting days and mapping territory and deciding whether he was worth the truth. "Both," he said. "It's both." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned back to Sorvain. "You said 3 factions," Elira said. "Possibly 4. "Yes." "The morning council session will flush Craveth's people," Elira said. "The others will watch and wait for an opening. They'll want to see how the chamber receives the charge. If there's division—" "There will be division," Sorvain said. "There's always division when someone powerful goes down. The question is which way it falls." "Then we need it to fall a specific way." Elira looked at Valor. "Can you call an emergency session instead of the standard morning convening? Something that requires the full council, not just the available members." "Yes," he said, "for matters of imperial security." "Then call it for midnight," she said. "Not morning. Midnight tonight. Full council required. Everyone present." She paused. "Craveth's arrest is the stated reason, but Sorvain's presence here tonight, the 2 bloodlines in the same room, the star above the palace, that becomes the actual agenda." Valor looked at her. "You want to make it a demonstration. I want to make it a fact," she said. "There's a difference. A demonstration is something you perform to create an impression. A fact is something that's already true and simply hasn't been acknowledged yet." Her voice was steady and completely without performance. "I'm already what I am. The people in that council chamber should know what they're dealing with before they decide whether to be part of the problem or part of what comes after it." The hall was quiet. Valor thought about 20 years of ruling through fear, through the calculated absence of uncertainty, through the careful management of what people knew and when they knew it and how it was framed. He thought about how comprehensively that system had produced a court that was obedient and a palace full of men like Craveth who had been running their own calculations in the gaps that obedience creates. He thought about a woman mapping territory by footsteps. He thought about what she was proposing, which was the opposite of everything he had built, and which was also, he understood with the clarity of a man who has finally turned to face the thing he's been circling, correct? "Drayle," he said. "Already moving," Drayle said from somewhere behind him, and Valor heard him leaving the hall with the brisk step of a man who had been waiting for a direction and had received one. The council chamber at midnight looked like what it was, a room full of powerful people who had been woken and summoned and were managing their alarm with varying degrees of success. 23 members. The 3 seats suspended pending Craveth's investigation sat empty, which was itself a statement. 3 gaps in the council table that everyone's eyes moved to and away from, with the restless avoidance of people trying not to look at an open wound. Valor stood at the head of the table. He had not changed out of the plain riding clothes. This too was a choice, and he had made it deliberately, because a king who comes to an emergency midnight council in road-dirty traveling clothes is communicating something specific about the urgency of the situation, and he wanted the situation to be read accurately. He presented the Craveth charge in 7 minutes, tightly. The file, the 42-year history, the compound in the Ashfen foothills, the evidence currently being inventoried. He answered 3 questions and declined 2 others on the grounds that they would be addressed in formal proceedings. He watched faces while he talked. Not obviously, not in the way that made men feel watched, but in the continuous peripheral reading of a man who had been studying rooms for 20 years. He counted 6 faces that went carefully blank when he named Craveth's network specifically. Not surprised blank, controlled blank. The blankness of concealment. He noted them. Then he said, "There is a second matter." The chamber shifted. The particular shift of a room that was already at high alert, discovering that high alert was not the ceiling. He looked at the door. Alira came in. She was wearing the dark gray dress from the compound, which was in no better condition than his riding clothes, and her hair was still loose, and her eyes were the pale gray that contained, at the edges, the silver that was no longer entirely retreating. She walked into the council chamber without a guide, and without hesitation, and found the empty chair that had been placed at the table's far end, Drael's doing, specific placement, deliberate, and sat in it with the uprightness of a woman who has spent her whole life being told how much space she is allowed and has decided tonight to stop calculating by someone else's measure. Servain came in behind her. She stood rather than sat. Northern delegation, 3 members. They arranged themselves along the wall with the quiet competence of people who know their role in a scene. The council stared. Valor let them stare for exactly long enough to be uncomfortable. Then he said, "Lady Alira Voss, my fated mate, as recognized by the ancient bonding pact on record with the Imperial Archive." He paused. "A fact I declined on the terrace 40 days ago, and am correcting now." The chamber erupted. Not all at once. It erupted in the specific staggered way of a room full of people who are reacting to different parts of the same statement at different speeds. Some of them were reacting to the correction itself. Some were reacting to Alira's presence. Some, Valor saw, were reacting to something else entirely. To the silver at the edges of her eyes that they had noticed and were deciding how to process. He waited. When the noise reached its peak and began to subside, he said, "The file I presented tonight names House Craveth as the primary documented actor in a 40-year surveillance and containment operation targeting the Eastern bloodline." He looked at the 6 careful blank faces. "The investigation will determine whether additional parties were involved. Anyone who believes they may have information relevant to that investigation is encouraged to provide it voluntarily." He paused. The alternative is less comfortable. Silence. One of the 6 careful blank faces moved. Lord Tiveth, Eastern Council, 2nd seat. He was 54 and had the look of a man who had made calculated investments his whole life and was now performing a very rapid reassessment of the portfolio. He opened his mouth. "My king," he said, "with respect, the nature of the bloodline, what it represents, there are those on this council who have had legitimate concerns about—" "Sit down, Tiveth," said Lady Marin Ashford from the far end of the table. She was 70, white-haired, had held the southern seat for 30 years, and had the voice of a woman who was done with several things simultaneously. "You're about to explain why you helped someone surveil a minor noblewoman for 40 years, and I genuinely cannot imagine a version of that sentence that ends well for you." Teveth sat down. Valor looked at Alira. She was watching the council, watching them, with her silver-edged eyes, and her face had the quality of complete attention without performance. She was reading the room the way she had always read rooms, with every sense available, and she was not afraid. She was something more specific than not afraid. She was certain, in the particular way of a person who has been managing uncertainty long enough that certainty, when it arrives, feels less like relief and more like recognition. He thought, this is what she was going to be all along, and I almost made it impossible. He thought about all the things that power costs when it is not accounted for, all the blind spots it creates. The empire runs on fear, and fear requires that you never look directly at what you're afraid of. And what Valor had been afraid of for 20 years was the particular vulnerability of being wrong. So he had built systems to prevent being wrong. He had cultivated the appearance of certainty so completely that it had become, in practice, indistinguishable from the real thing. And then he had stood on the terrace and made a decision in front of 400 people that had been wrong in every direction simultaneously, and the system he'd built to prevent that had not stopped it, had in fact enabled it, had made the decision feel clean when it was anything but, had let him walk off the dais without looking back because looking back was not what the system allowed, what it had cost. A woman sitting in a cold tower for 40 days, counting. What it had nearly cost, everything. The council will convene formally in 72 hours, Valor said. Full session. The Kraveth investigation will be the first order of business. The second order of business will be a review of the mating bond record and Lady Voss's status and accommodations within the imperial court. But see it. He let that sit. Anyone who wishes to contest either matter is welcome to do so through the formal process. He looked at the 6 careful blank faces. Anyone who prefers to contest it through other means should understand that the events of tonight have revised the available means considerably. He did not look at Elira. He did not need to. He could feel the bond in his chest with the clarity of something that has stopped being incomplete and started being something else. Not finished, not closed, but directional. Moving. The way a river after a flood has found its new course and is moving in it. The council was dismissed at midnight. They filed out with the careful-faced efficiency of people doing rapid private calculations. Some of them would talk to each other in corridors. Some would send riders before morning. The 6 careful blank faces would have a very difficult night, and some of them would make the correct choice, and some would not. And Valor would deal with the ones who didn't as they came. He stood at the head of the empty table. Elira had not moved. She was sitting at the far end of the council table in the chair Dryel had placed, and she was looking at the empty room, and she was not performing serenity. Her jaw was carrying tension. Her hands on the table's edge had the particular grip of someone who has been holding on through something long and difficult, and is slowly, carefully, allowing themselves to notice that the immediate thing is over. He walked to her, sat in the chair beside her, which put them at the corner of the table with the empty room stretching out before them, and the midnight quiet of the palace around them, and the compound mud still on both their boots. "The 6, she said. "You saw them." "Yes." "2 of them will cooperate," she said. "The other 4 are going to be the problem." "Tevith isn't going to be a problem after tonight," he said. Lady Ashford just ended him in front of the room. Despite everything, Elira almost smiled. It was the same almost as before. He was beginning to collect them. "She did," Elira said. "I liked her." "She liked you," he said. "I could tell." A pause. The quiet of the empty chamber. Outside, somewhere in the palace, Sorvain and Dryel were dealing with the logistics of the northern delegation's formal registration as guests, which was a mundane piece of administration that was also, in context, a significant political statement. "What you said," Elira said carefully. "At the table. The correction." "Yes." "You said it in front of all of them." "I said it in front of all of them," he confirmed. She was quiet. Her hands on the table edge had loosened somewhat. She was looking at the far wall of the council chamber, at nothing in particular, with the eyes that were no longer quite what they had been before tonight, and were not yet entirely what they were becoming. "That's a harder thing to take back than a terrace," she said. "I know." "I'm not saying I want you to take it back," she said precisely. "I know that too." She turned to look at him. The silver in her eyes caught the lamplight, and he looked back at her, directly, the way he had learned to look in 40 days of mornings, and did not look away. "Valor," she said. "Yes." "If the 4 factions move before the formal session, they'll move," he said. "That's already decided. The question is where and when and in what form." "I need to tell you something about what happened at the compound," she said. "Something I didn't say in the hall because I needed to think through it first." She paused. Her jaw held the slight tightness again. "When I used it, what I have, it wasn't just what Kraveth saw. The force of it. There was a moment where I couldn't control the direction, where it started doing something I didn't intend. He waited. It corrected, she said. It didn't cause damage beyond the room, but there was a moment where it could have. She was not looking for reassurance. She was delivering information with the same flat precision she brought to everything. I don't fully understand the edges of it yet. And 4 factions moving before I have control of the edges is a problem, he said, a substantial problem. He thought about this. The soldier in him processed it as a tactical variable. The man who had spent 40 days in a cold tower sitting room processed it as something more personal. What do you need? He said. Same question as before. Different weight now. She looked at him for a long moment. Time, she said, which is the one thing we don't have. Then we make it, he said. We take the 72 hours before the formal session, and we use every one of them to force the faction's hands in sequence rather than simultaneously. Betrayal can... The chamber door opened, hard, not burst, but opened with the specific urgency of someone who has information that cannot wait for the appropriate knock. It was one of Valor's gate guards. Young, out of breath, the expression of a man who has been running and is now delivering something he does not fully understand, and is also fairly certain he does not want to understand. My king, the guard said, the southern gate. There are riders. He paused in the way of someone choosing words carefully. A lot of them. They're not flying house colors. Another pause. But there's something above them, in the sky. Valor stood. Not one star now. 3. 3 lights burning in the sky above the southern approach to the capital, equidistant, moving in formation, with a quality of arrangement that was not astronomical and not accidental, and not any of the things that lights in the night sky usually were. Valor looked at Alira. Alira was already standing. She was looking at the chamber wall as if she could see through it to the southern sky, and her eyes were full silver again, lit entirely, and her face had the expression of someone who has just received information that changes the shape of everything. That's not Sorvain, she said. No, he said. And it's not Kraveth's network, she said. They don't have this. Her voice was completely level, which was the most frightening thing in the room. Valor, something older than all of us, just decided to arrive. She turned to him. Silver eyes, compound mud on her boots, the empty Imperial Council chamber at midnight behind her, the sounds of a city that did not yet know what was approaching its southern gate coming faintly through the palace walls. What do you want to do? She said. He looked at her. He thought about the question and what it meant that she was asking it. Not deferring, not waiting for orders. Asking. Asking him as the man she had decided, over 40 days and one long terrible night, was worth telling the truth to. He put his hand out. Not to take hers. Just out. Available. She looked at it with her silver eyes. Then she put her hand in his. We go to the gate, he said. They moved. The southern gate of Dreadmoor's capital had stood for 200 years. It had been built by Valor's great-great-grandfather in a period of relative peace, which meant it had been built to last rather than built to hold. And the distinction mattered now in the way distinctions about foundations always matter, when what's above them is under pressure. The stone was good. The iron reinforcements were good. The men on the walls were Valor's, and they were steady, because he had spent 20 years selecting for steady, and tonight was the first time he had needed all of it at once. He reached the gate wall with Alira's hand still in his, and took the stairs to the parapet at a pace that was not quite running, and what he saw from the top stopped him for exactly 2 seconds before his soldier's mind reasserted and began processing. The riders numbered perhaps 40. They had stopped 200 yards from the gate in a loose formation that was not aggressive, not arranged for assault, not pushing forward, and they were waiting with the particular patience of people who have come a very long distance and are comfortable waiting a little longer. Their horses were large and dark, and showing no distress, which told him something about the riders, because horses always knew. Above them, the 3 stars burned. From the parapet, they were larger than they had looked from the council chamber window. Not blinding, not the harsh white of the star above the compound that afternoon, but cooler, deeper, with a blue edge that Valor had no reference for in any natural phenomenon he had encountered. They moved in their equidistant formation with the deliberateness of something steered rather than drifting, and they threw no shadows. which was wrong in the way that things are wrong when they operate by different rules than the ones you have built your understanding on. Illyra stood beside him on the parapet. Her free hand was at her side. Her eyes tracked the three lights with the focused attention of someone reading, and her jaw was held carefully. "What are they?" Valor said. Quiet. For her. "Old," she said. "Older than the ceiling. Older than the bloodlines as we understand them." She paused. "I don't think they're hostile." "You don't think?" "I think," she said, with the precision she always brought to things she was not certain of, "that hostile is not the framework they operate in. I think they came because of tonight, because of what I did at the compound, because of the council." She looked at him. "Because of what you said at the table." He held her gaze. "Then I'll go to them." "We'll go to them," she said. He did not argue. He was past arguing. He turned to the captain of the gate guard, a solid, gray-eyed woman named Ferris, who had been holding her face in professional neutrality since they arrived, and deserved a commendation for it. "Open the gate, no weapons drawn. Hold the wall." "My king," Ferris said, and meant it. "Dis." They went out through the gate on foot, the two of them, with Drael 10 paces behind because Drael had arrived on the parapet somewhere between the council chamber and now, and had made his own assessment of the situation and concluded that 10 paces was the correct distance. The 40 riders watched them come across the 200 yards of dark road without moving. The leader was a woman. She sat her horse with the uprightness of someone who has been sitting horses for a very long time and has lost the ability to do it any other way. She was older than Sorvain by 20 years, maybe more, with white hair worn loose and a face that had the specific quality of age that comes not from time alone, but from carrying something large through time. Her eyes, when they caught the starlight, were not silver. They were something between silver and white, the color of something so far developed past its origin that origin no longer adequately describes it. She looked at Illyra. She said in a language that was not the common tongue and was not any northern dialect Valor had heard, something with 3 syllables. Illyra went very still. "You understand that?" Valor said quietly. "I shouldn't," Illyra said. "I've never heard it." A pause. "But yes." The old woman on the horse waited. "She said," Illyra said slowly, "approximately. We have been waiting for the door to open." The old woman inclined her head when Illyra translated it. Then she looked at Valor. Her white silver eyes moved over him with an attention that had nothing predatory in it and nothing deferential either. It was the attention of someone taking an honest inventory. She spoke again. 3 sentences this time. Illyra listened. Her hand still in his, tightened slightly. Not fear. Something more like the physical response to receiving information you were not prepared for. "She says," Illyra said, "that the ceiling was placed by her grandmother's line, as protection, not against the world." She paused. "Against what happens when the gift surfaces before the person carrying it is ready." She paused again. "She says that what I did at the compound, the way it stopped before it caused greater damage, was the test. Not a conscious test. The gift testing itself." Illyra's voice was very careful. "And I passed it, which is why they came." Valor looked at the old woman. "What do they want?" Illyra asked. The old woman answered. "To return something," Illyra said, "that has been held in trust for the Eastern bloodline since the sealing." She stopped. "She's not going to explain what it is. She says I'll know it when it's returned." The night around them was very quiet. 40 riders, 2 lights above the gate wall, where Faris and her guards watched, 3 stars in the sky above the riders, and the winter cold coming off the Ashfin Mountains with the indifferent thoroughness of cold that owes nothing to anyone. Valor thought about what it meant to stand here, at the gate of his own capital, in the dark, at the end of a day that had started with a file in a restricted archive and had passed through a compound in the foothills and a midnight council session and had arrived at this, a woman with white silver eyes returning something ancient to the person it belonged to, with the Alpha King of Dreadmoor standing beside her because he had put his hand out and she had taken it. He thought about what bravery actually looks like. Not the version the histories told, the charge, the decisive moment, the single act of valor that gets carved into stone. The version that looks like going to a tower for 40 days when it would have been easier not to. The version that looks like saying the wrong thing in front of 400 people and then, slowly, with considerable discomfort, understanding why it was wrong and going back. The version that looks like standing in the dark at your own gate with a woman whose eyes are full of starlight and choosing to stay beside her instead of behind her. He had spent 20 years building an empire on what he had believed was strength. He understood now, with the specific clarity of a man who has seen the difference in the space of a single day, that what he had built was not strength. It was the performance of strength. And the performance had been so complete, so long sustained, that it had hollowed out the space where the actual thing should have been, and left behind a man who could conquer 47 kingdoms and was brought to a complete stop by a woman who asked him whether he understood why he had been wrong. He had been afraid of her. He recognized this now from the safety of the other side of it. On the terrace, with his wolf screaming and 400 people watching, he had been afraid. Not of her blindness, of what she represented, of the thing the bond demanded, which was the one thing his entire system of power had no category for: accountability to another person, the requirement to be known, not feared, known. And he had called it weakness and walked away. The old woman dismounted. She moved with the deliberateness of great age and complete certainty, and she came toward them on foot, and her riders stayed where they were. She stopped before Elira and reached into the coat she wore and took out something small enough to fit in her closed fist. She opened her hand. It was a stone, or it looked like a stone, dark, irregular, the size of a walnut, but it was not reflecting the starlight. It was absorbing it, pulling it in, and from somewhere inside its dark center a light was moving, slow and silver, and alive in the way that fire is alive, with its own will in its own direction. The old woman spoke. "She says," Elira said softly, "put your hand out." Elira put her free hand out, the one that wasn't holding his. The old woman placed the stone in her palm. What happened next was not dramatic. There was no explosion of light, no sound, no physical force. It was smaller than that, and more significant than anything dramatic could have been. The stone dissolved. That was the only word for it. It simply ceased to be a stone and became instead something that moved into Elira's skin at the center of her palm and traveled up her arm in the same pathways that the silver marks had traveled, from wrist to elbow to shoulder to chest. And where it went, the marks appeared briefly, bright and clear, and then settled and did not fade. Elira made a sound, not pain, not even surprise, the sound of a person receiving something they have been carrying the absence of for so long that the receiving of it is indistinguishable from grief. Her hand in his tightened to the edge of pain, and he held it. He held it, and he did not say anything because there was nothing to say that would have been adequate. And inadequate things said in sacred moments are one of the primary ways that men ruin them. And he was done ruining things through the reflexive deployment of words as substitutes for presence. He was present. That was what he had to offer. He held her hand in the cold at the southern gate of his capital, while something ancient came home to the person it belonged to, and he stayed. The old woman watched. Her white silver eyes went from Elira to Veilor and held there for a moment with an attention that felt like assessment, and then shifted into something that felt, though he had no framework for reading the face of a woman this old with eyes this specific, like approval. She said something short, a single sentence. Elira laughed. A small sound startled out of her and then held in, and then released. She turned to Veilor. Her eyes were full silver, completely brilliant and steady, and fully hers in a way that none of the previous silver had been. Not the emergency silver of the compound, not the controlled silver of the council chamber, but the silver of a person who has stopped managing something and simply become it. "She says you held her hand through the whole thing," Elira said. "She says that's the part she wasn't sure about." Veilor looked at the old woman. "That was the test," he said. The old woman inclined her head. Then she turned and walked back to her horse, and mounted with the same deliberate certainty she dismounted with, and without further ceremony the 40 riders turned and moved away from the gate, south, back into the dark of the road they'd come from, and the 3 stars above them began slowly to rise, moving upward, increasing their distance from the ground, fading as they went, until they were indistinguishable from the actual stars of the actual winter sky above the capital. Veilor watched them go. Beside him, Elira watched them go. "What did you receive?" he said. Can you tell? She was quiet for a moment. It's not a thing, she said. It's more like a completed circuit. Everything that was there before, but with the missing part returned. She considered. Like a word you've known your whole life, but only partially, and someone tells you the rest of it, and you realize the partial version was always trying to be this. He looked at her, the winter dark, the gate behind them, the capital that did not know what had just happened at its southern edge, and would need to be told carefully and in the right sequence by people who understood both the content and the framing. The formal council session is in 72 hours, he said. I know. A lot of things will move between now and then. I know that too. He turned toward the gate. She walked beside him. Betrayal fell in behind them at his 10 paces, with the professional silence of a man who has seen a great deal tonight and is filing all of it for a later accounting. The gate opened at their approach. Ferris and her guards on the wall watched them come through with the careful expressions of people performing the specific discipline of not asking questions when questions are not their assignment. They walked back through the gate and into the capital. The streets around the palace quarter were quiet at this hour. Only the occasional guard rotation and the distant sound of the city settling into the late end of night. The stars, the actual stars, the ones that had always been there, were out in full. Veilor stopped in the courtyard. Not for any tactical reason. He stopped because something needed to be said, and this was where it needed to be said, in the open, not inside any room with any other purpose. Illyra stopped beside him. I owe you an accounting, he said. She waited. Not a political one, he said. The political accounting will happen in the council session, and I'll handle it correctly. This is the other kind. He looked at the courtyard stones, then at her. He had spent 20 years being careful about where he directed his eyes and for what purpose, and he was done calculating the purpose. He looked at her because she was the person he was talking to, and she deserved the full attention of it. I saw you on the terrace, and I made a decision about what you were worth before you had said a word to me, before I had been in a room with you. I made the decision based on what you couldn't do instead of what you were. He paused. I'm not asking you to forgive it. I know the weight of it. I'm telling you that I know the weight of it. She held his gaze. Silver eyes, steady, reading him in the full sensory way she read everything. His breath, his posture, the specific quality of his voice when it is not performing. You know what I spent the first week in that tower doing, she said. Mapping it, he said. And the second week? I don't know the second week. Deciding, she said, whether I was going to let what you did be the thing that defined what came after. Whether I was going to spend my time in that tower being the woman who had been rejected, or the woman who was figuring out what she was. She paused. It would have been easier to stay angry. Anger is simpler. It has very clean edges. But you didn't. I didn't have the luxury, she said. Whatever was waking up inside me required me to be all the way present. You can't manage something like this from inside a wall of anger. You need your whole attention. She looked at him steadily. And then you kept coming to the tower, and I had to decide what that meant. What did it mean? She was quiet for a moment. It meant you were capable of it, she said. Showing up when it's hard, when it costs you something, when the court is watching and drawing conclusions, and the easiest thing would have been to leave the letter unanswered and let me stay in the tower until the situation resolved itself. She tilted her head slightly. You didn't do the easiest thing. I did the easiest thing on the terrace, he said. Yes, she said. And then you didn't do it again. She let that sit. That's not nothing. They stood in the courtyard in the winter dark, and the stars were out, and the capital was quiet, and the gate behind them was closed, and Marta and Till and Wren were in the eastern tower that Illyra would not be sleeping in tonight, and the restricted archive had a file with a red ink name that was going to pull apart the structure of the Imperial Council over the next 72 hours, and none of that was resolved yet. None of it was clean, but it was present, and it was honest, and it was moving in a direction that had not been available 41 days ago. The south-facing rooms, Illyra said, in the residential wing. Yes, I'll take them, she said. Tonight. He nodded. Something in his chest that had been careful for 41 days became slightly less careful. The formal council session was not clean. Valor had expected this and planned for it anyway, because planning for something you know will be difficult is not optimism. It is the particular discipline of a man who has understood that outcomes are shaped by the quality of preparation, even when preparation does not guarantee them. The Craveth charge occupied the first 4 hours. 2 of the 6 careful blank faces from the midnight session had come in with counsel prepared and objections structured, and the specific body language of men who had made a decision in the night and were committing to it. They challenged the legality of the restricted archive unsealing. They challenged the chain of custody on the compound evidence. They raised procedural questions about the emergency council convening with the practiced desperation of people who know the substance is lost and are fighting on process. Lady Maren Ashford dismantled each challenge with the thoroughness of someone who has been waiting 30 years for exactly this kind of fight and has not spent those years idle. She was methodical and complete and had, Valor noted, done considerable reading between midnight and morning. She did not look at him for support or approval. She simply worked. The 2 men who had prepared objections ran out of them by the 3rd hour. The vote on the Craveth charge was 17-4, with 2 abstentions. The 4 who voted against would be reviewed. The 2 who abstained had made a calculation that was, in its way, its own statement, and Valor filed it for a separate conversation. The second order of business was the mating bond. Elara was present for this session. She sat in the same chair she had taken at midnight. Drayle had ensured it was there, and she wore court clothes for the first time, dark blue, formal, the Eastern House colors she was entitled to and had not been provided with when she arrived, and which Valor had sourced that morning with the specific urgency of a man correcting an omission that had been obvious from the beginning. Her silver eyes were present but not dominant. She had, in the night, found a calibration, the way you find the level of a new instrument after a period of trial and adjustment. She looked to the council like a woman who knew exactly where she was and had decided to be there. The bond review was shorter than the Craveth hearing. The pact was the pact. The record was the record. Valor's formal correction of his terrorist declaration was entered into the archive. The council confirmed Lady Elara Voss's standing as the Alpha King's fated mate and her position within the imperial court as a recognized bondholder with full attendant protections. 3 council members asked questions about the celestial bloodline. 2 of them were asking because they were frightened, and frightened men ask questions to manage their fear. One of them was asking because she was genuinely curious and had read everything available on the subject in the 17 hours since the midnight session, which was Lady Ashford, and her questions were the only ones worth answering fully. Elara answered them. She answered them with the directness and precision that she brought to everything, without performance, without reassurance, without any of the softening that people tend to apply to information they're afraid will be difficult to receive. She answered Lady Ashford's questions about the nature of the gift, about what it could and could not do, about what she understood of its limits and what she was still learning. She was honest about the still learning parts. She did not make it sound more controlled than it was, or less manageable than it was. Valor watched the chamber while she talked. He watched men and women adjust in real time. The adjustment was not uniform and it was not comfortable, and for some of them it was a process that would continue long after this session and would have to be managed through subsequent interactions and accumulated evidence. People do not stop being afraid of things they do not understand simply because the thing demonstrates competence in one meeting. Understanding takes time. It takes repetition. It takes the gradual replacement of an abstract threat with a specific person who keeps showing up and keeps being honest and keeps demonstrating that honest is actually what you said it was. That was the work ahead. He knew it. She knew it. They had discussed it, briefly, that morning, in the south-facing room over the breakfast that Marta had produced from somewhere with the focused determination of a woman who had waited 41 days to produce it. And they had not made it sound smaller than it was. What they had agreed in the south-facing room with the winter morning coming through the window and the city waking up below them was this. The work was real, and it was long, and neither of them was going to pretend it was simple. The bond was real, and it was incomplete in ways that would require time and intention to address, and neither of them was going to pretend that the feelings generated by an extraordinary and difficult 41 days were the same as the foundation of a life together. They were a beginning that had been delayed and complicated and nearly destroyed by decisions made in fear and pride, but a beginning nonetheless. "The council is dismissed," Valor said when the formal business was concluded. "A full accounting of the Craveth investigation will be provided in 30 days. Lady Voss will be formally presented to the court at the Festival of Crowns." He had written that last sentence into the agenda that morning. Elira had read it, had felt it, under her fingers when she traced the embossed agenda that had been prepared in the format specified for blind readers, which was a format the Imperial Archive possessed but had never once used in his reign, and which had required 3 attendants to locate in the archive basement at 6 in the morning. She had run her fingers over the sentence and said nothing for a moment, and then said, "Thank you for that." Not for the presentation, for the format of the page. He understood the distinction. He was getting better at understanding her distinctions. The weeks between the council session and the Festival of Crowns were not peaceful. The factions moved, not all at once and not in the open, because the council session had altered the available terrain considerably, and people who operated in shadow prefer shadow that remains consistent. But they moved. 3 attempts to access the restricted archive. 1 effort to bring Craveth's case to an outside arbitrator that failed on procedural grounds. 2 council members who resigned their seats before the investigation reached them, which was its own form of answer. Valor handled each thing as it came, with betrayal, with the 12 men who had ridden east and were now, collectively, the most trusted security detail in the Empire by virtue of having ridden through a situation that tested trust in the most direct way available. With Lady Ashford, who turned out to be a more useful ally than anyone he had deliberately cultivated in 20 years, because she operated from principle rather than calculation and principle, it turned out, was harder to outmaneuver than calculation. And with Elira, this was new. This was the thing that the histories would not record because it was not dramatic, and it was not visible, and it did not lend itself to the kind of narrative compression that history requires. He worked with her. Every major decision that touched on the bloodline situation, which was, given the scope of the Craveth network, most decisions in the 3 weeks before the festival, was discussed with her before it was implemented. Not because she demanded it, because it was better for having been discussed, because she saw things he did not see and named things he would have elided and told him when his instinct toward decisive unilateral action was serving the situation and when it was serving his need to feel decisive. She was not always right. She said so, on the occasions when she wasn't, with the same directness with which she said everything else. He was not always right either. He was getting more comfortable saying so. This was not a comfortable process. Decades of being the final word on everything does not yield gracefully to the practice of consultation. There were mornings in the south-facing room where he caught himself half-forming the sentence and then pulling it back, where the pull towards certainty was so habitual it almost got ahead of him, where he had to consciously choose the harder thing. He did not always manage it. She told him when he didn't, and he heard it, and the next time he managed it slightly better. This, he was understanding, was what it actually looked like. Not a destination, a practice. The Festival of Crowns arrived on a day of hard winter sun. The Imperial Terrace was full. Every noble house in the Empire, every major delegation, 40 years of imperial court compressed into one space with the specific social density of an occasion that everyone understood to be a pivot point, whether or not they knew the details. The court knew the broad shape of the Craveth story. They knew there had been an emergency session. They knew the Alpha King had corrected a declaration made on this terrace at an earlier ceremony on this terrace. They did not know, most of them, what they were about to see. Valor stood on the obsidian dais. He had stood here before, dozens of times, for the events and formalities that this space was built for. He had always stood here with the quality of complete command, the certainty that the room was configured around him and would remain so because he willed it. He stood here now with something different, not less certain. A different kind of certain. The certainty of a man who is not trying to control the room and has discovered, to his genuine surprise, that not trying to control it is its own form of authority. He looked east. She came through the eastern gate. No court warden this time. No hand on anyone's arm. She walked onto the Imperial Terrace alone, in the deep blue of her eastern house colors with the silver embroidery of her bloodline. Betrayal had found the house records, which specified the pattern, and the court seamstresses had worked for 3 days on it, and she walked with the same careful uprightness he had watched cross this terrace 42 days ago, and which he now understood was not fragility and had never been fragility. She walked differently than she had. Her eyes were open and silver and reading the terrace with the full spectrum attention of someone who sees the world by more than one mechanism, and where they moved, people stepped back. Not in fear. In the specific, involuntary response of people who are in the presence of something that operates at a frequency they cannot entirely process, and their bodies know it before their minds do. She reached the dais. She looked up at him. Full silver. Clear and steady and completely Illyra. He stepped down from the dais, not in the protocol, not in any ceremony he had reviewed or any precedent he could cite. He stepped down from the obsidian platform that had been the symbolic center of his power for 20 years and stood on the terrace level with the woman he had rejected from that platform and looked at her at eye level. The terrace was absolutely silent. He said, clearly enough for the silence to carry it, "I was wrong." Not a political statement, not a formal correction for the archive. 3 words on the imperial terrace in front of everyone. The sound of them landing in the silence had a weight that no proclamation he had ever issued had matched, because proclamations are designed to be impressive, and this was designed to be true. Illyra looked at him. Then she looked at the terrace around them, at 400 people who were very still, at the court that had watched her cross this space 42 days ago and said nothing and arranged their faces into whatever expression they had calculated appropriate, at the empire that had, in its collective witnessed way, participated in what had been done to her. She let the moment be what it was. Then she looked back at him. "I know," she said. "Not forgiveness, not absolution. Knowledge. The acknowledgement of a person who has done the hard work of understanding what happened and has arrived at a place that is on the other side of it, which is not the same place she started and does not erase the distance traveled, but does not require the distance to define everything that follows." He offered his hand. She looked at it. Her silver eyes held the winter light. She put her hand in his. They stood together on the imperial terrace, not on the dais, not elevated above the court, on the same level of stone as everyone else, and the Festival of Crowns began. Years passed. The way years do when the fundamental structure of things has changed, not without difficulty, not without the daily friction of rebuilding something from materials that were originally used to build something else, but with the quality of direction, of intention. The Kraveth investigation ran for 8 months and restructured 3 council seats, and produced, in its final report, a document that was added to the Imperial Archive under the heading of what the Empire had actually done rather than what the official history had said, which was Illyra's framing and Valor's decision to use it. Sylvain took a formal advisory position, the first such position created in Dreadmoor's history for a function that had not previously existed in the Imperial structure because the Imperial structure had not previously acknowledged that bloodlines like hers were real. This required inventing the position from precedent and principle rather than existing category, which was work that took considerable negotiation and produced a document that neither Sylvain nor the Council was entirely satisfied with, which Valor had come to understand was a reliable sign that a compromise had been correctly reached. The Eastern Tower was decommissioned. Valor had made this decision without discussing it with anyone, which Illyra pointed out when she found out. He acknowledged the point. She decided not to press it, which was its own decision, made with her own reasons, and he did not pretend those reasons were made for him. He learned things. This was the part he had not planned for and would not have known to plan for, that being in honest relationship with another person is an education that has no terminal point, that every assumption he discovered he was carrying was replaced, not by the absence of assumptions, but by better ones, more specific, more earned, more open to revision. That being known, actually known, was not the vulnerability he had spent 20 years managing against. It was the thing that made the other parts possible. He could not have explained this to the man who had stood on the terrace 42 days before everything changed. That man was not built to receive the explanation. He had needed the entire long process of receiving it, the cold tower, the counted days, the morning visits, the file with the red ink name, the hand in the dark at the southern gate, to understand something that the process itself had taught him, and that the outcome alone could never have provided. The strongest position you can occupy, he understood now, is not the one from which you cannot be challenged. It is the one from which you can afford to be honest, because you have built something that does not depend on the performance of certainty. What he had built before was the performance. What he was building now was the thing itself, imperfectly, with friction, without the clean lines that the histories would eventually draw around it, but building. On a morning in late spring, 2 years after the Festival of Crowns, Vylor stood on the balcony of the residential wing's south-facing rooms and looked at the capital in the early light. The city below him was the same city, same streets, same buildings, same gate to the south, where 40 riders had waited in the winter dark. Same imperial terrace to the east where everything had pivoted twice. But the architecture of the empire beneath it, the structure of authority and accountability, the channels through which power moved and by what right, that had been under sustained revision for 2 years and was no longer the same. Not finished. There was no finished, but changed in ways that were legible if you had the original to compare it to. He heard Elira before she appeared beside him. The particular quality of her footsteps, which he had learned in 5 months of morning visits to a tower and 2 years of sharing this wing. She stood beside him at the balcony rail and looked at the city with her silver eyes, which were calibrated now in the way that things calibrate when they have found their natural level, present but not overwhelming, reading the world at the full depth available to them, which was a depth he had no direct access to and had stopped trying to imagine and started asking about when he wanted to know. "Drael is asking about the Halveth delegation," she said. "The morning session." "I know. I'll deal with it. He's been waiting for an hour. He's been waiting more patiently than usual, which means he thinks I need the morning." She was quiet for a moment. "Do you?" He looked at the city, at the spring light coming over the eastern walls, at the star that was not in the sky this morning because it was morning and the stars were not visible, and Elira's eyes were their own settled silver, and there was no crisis, no compound, no southern gate with 40 riders waiting, just a city waking up and a man who had learned over the longest 2 years of his life the difference between running something and being responsible for it. "No," he said. "I'm ready." She nodded. She did not move immediately. She stood at the rail with her face toward the light, and he stood beside her, and they held the morning for 1 more minute before the day's demands reasserted. Then she turned from the rail. He turned with her. They went in. The Empire Vylor. Ashrin, rebuilt after the wreckage of everything he had been, did not look like the empire he had run for 20 years. It was louder, more contested, more frequently inconvenient. Accountability is louder than fear. People who do not fear you will tell you when you are wrong, and they will not always be polite about it. And the noise of that is the sound of something working rather than the silence of something that has been silenced. He learned to hear the difference. Elira's gift, fully received and practiced over 2 years, was not what Craveth had imagined in his 40 years of scheming. It was not a weapon. It was not a resource. It was, she said once, to Vylor, in the late dark of an ordinary night, when they were both tired and honest in the way that tired and honest go together, like being able to read the room at a level that has nothing to do with what people say out loud. She could feel the shape of a truth in the same way she had once felt the shape of a room, the difference between what was said and what was meant, the specific texture of a lie, the particular quality of a person who was capable of something they had not yet decided whether to do. This was not comfortable to live with. She had said this too. She had not made it sound like a gift in the simple sense. He had said, "I know. It was the most important thing I ever did, and it was not comfortable." She had understood what he meant. He had understood that she had understood, and that understanding had the quality of two people who have found, through difficulty and error and the sustained willingness to remain present, something that requires both of them to be exactly what they are. Not perfect, not clean, not the story that the court would eventually tell about them, which would smooth the rough edges and clarify the timeline and make the 42 days into something with a neater arc. The actual thing, rough-edged, honestly achieved, belonging to both of them in the specific way that only things that have cost something real can belong to the people who paid for them. The empire stood. They stood in it. That was enough. That was, in fact, everything.